Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple more people and we'll get started shortly. Thanks for joining us today. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are now going to start our panel discussion about, building international software communities. I would love to invite our panelists today to join with their audio and video. Right now we have Manuel, Hung, and Anika with us, and we're just waiting on a couple more of our panelists. All right, hopefully they can join me on video. And if you'd like, please feel free to minimize the PDF viewer if you'd like to see our faces a little bit bigger. Hi, Manuel.
Hi, Alison. How are you?
Hi. Hi, Hong. It's great to see you both.
Hello, Alison. Hello, Manu.
Hello, Hung.
I'd love to give our other three panelists just a couple more minutes, if that's okay. And hopefully we can find them soon. Hi, Anika.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, well, let's not waste our time and get started. Thank you very much for being here. I see Regina has finally joined. Regina, could you please rejoin the audio for me? Today, we're going to ask some questions and get some answers. I think it's probably easiest if we go alphabetically in order of first name, just to make things a little simple. So to start off, I'd love if each of you could give a brief introduction of yourselves. Obviously, we know your names, but let us know your name, maybe we're pronouncing it incorrectly, where you're currently based, which open source projects and communities you're affiliated with, and maybe just a little highlight from the pandemic.
Should I start? Okay. So my name is Anita Cooper, and I'm currently based in Berlin. And I'm working with KDE as a marketing consultant. And I think the highlight for me for pandemic was that I moved to Berlin. And as KDE, I think it didn't change much, but yes, we had more online events now.
Thanks, Anika. Please go ahead.
Yes, so hello everyone. First of all, thank you, organizer for the invitation. My name is Hồng Phúc Đặng. I'm currently based also in Berlin, Germany, but normally I would be living in Asia. Of course, also of the pandemic, I've been here for a while already. So I'm associated with Force Asia. I'm one of the founders of the organization as well. So this is a Singapore-based organization that develop open source software and hardware. Our goal is to try to foster open source movement in Asia. And beside development of software and hardware, we also organize events similar to this. We had the Force Asia annual summit. We run a lot of online program to show people how to code and contribute to various open source projects. The pandemic, I think, is impact everywhere, everyone around the world, and also, of course, like the Force Asia community in several ways. So just 3 weeks ago, one of our core maintainer passed away in India when he was only 26. And the situation is so bad. There are majority of our contributors coming from India, and of course, it influenced the development of the projects. The people really just they struggling to survive. So being able to contribute to open source is really difficult now for developers coming from that region. We're doing hardware development. The production of hardware significantly slowed down due to the pandemic, the shortage of components. Chip production is also, the pricing also increased really high for us, like for organizations that develop open source hardware. So a lot of things happening at the moment, very challenging in order to sustain the community. But I'm glad that we still be able to stay together and continue what we are doing. Similar to the Linux app summit, we run our Force Asia summit online this year as well. So this is some of the highlights related to the pandemic.
Well, thank you. Hong, it looks like we lost your video, but while you're figuring that out, Manuel, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alison. Nice to meet you, everyone. I am from Mexico. I am living at Zacatecas City. It's placed at north of the country, and we have. I am working with open source for about 25 years. My professional career, I was starting working with the Unix system, so the evolution to Linux to open source was very natural for me. So here in Mexico, we are working. We have 9 years working to strengthen our FOSS community around all the country of Mexico. We have a very important community named the Open Source Lab. In Spanish is el Laboratorio de Software Libre, because my shirt is LabSol, Laboratorio de Software Libre. See, is the name of our community. Right now we have 65 university strengthening the community open source around these universities. As you see, it's a community of academics of universities working together to develop innovation projects. Every project, all the technologies exclusively, we are working with FOSS technologies. So we are conforming a very strong community using, develop, and adopting the use of open source software here in Mexico. Open Source Lab community is working development maybe around 51, 52 projects every 6 months with 120 students from the university working to develop this kind of project. So this, I think, is a very important community, strengthening the FOSS community. And right now, I am teacher from University of Zacatecas, the biggest university at our state. And recently, maybe 3 weeks ago, I am proudly member of Genome Foundation, and we are working together with Google open source community. So we are trying to ally with very important leaders about open source around the world. So this is me. Thank you for the invitation at this very important panel. Thank you, Alison.
You're most welcome. We're really happy to have you here too. Well, next would be Mustafa, and I see he's not joined with his microphone. I'd like to ask Mustafa, please rejoin the audio with the blue headset button underneath the videos. And while we wait for you to do this, Regina, would you please like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you once again, Alison. Sorry, I am not able to use my video at the moment. But I hope this is okay right now. Okay, yeah, so my name is Regina, and I'm from Nigeria, but I'm currently living in Sweden. And I moved over to Sweden basically during the pandemic, so there's quite a whole lot of changes. I'm a board member for the GNOME Foundation, and I'm also part of the founding members for GNOME Africa. I think basically, how did the pandemic affect us? Yeah, it did in several ways. First, we were supposed to have the first event in Africa for the first time for GNOME Foundation. But then it happened at the time when the pandemic just started, so we had to postpone it. And so we had a little bit of enthusiasm that went, not a bit reduced, because everyone was anticipating the event and having to introduce GNOME to Africa for the first time. It was what we all were looking out for. But then we compensated that by having a virtual event towards the end of the year, which was quite successful. We had quite a number of people attend the event. Right now, basically, what we're trying to do is to see how we can get into African universities, mainly by having the GNOME University Outreach Initiative in African universities for the first time. It's quite a very big project for us at the moment, because open source in Africa is still at its developing stage. There's still so much of introduction to do and all of that. But then we are quite excited that we have quite a number of applications, and we are looking forward to see how GNOME Foundation will be embraced around universities in Africa. So I think that's basically how the pandemic has affected us as a people. Yeah, I think Africa is a very unique place. So motivations come in different forms as to what you have in other parts of the world. And so the way we treat events here basically is different, and the way people get motivated to want to do partake in open source also is a lot different. So we're trying to look at other aspects of introducing people and possibly running more projects that is going to be possible, like a little bit of compensation for the work they're going to be doing in open source, to bring in more people into the project for GNOME Foundation. And so we are basically at the developing stage, and we're learning on the go at the moment, trying to find out more of what people require and how we could best feed contributors coming from Africa into the GNOME project. And I think that's basically where we are at the moment. Thank you, Alison, once again. And again, apologies that I can't do my video at the moment. And I hope the background is not noisy like I discussed with you. Oh, thank you.
That's okay. All right. Well, thank you, Regina. It was great to hear. Let's go on to Mustafa and then to Tomas. Mustafa, please introduce yourself. Let us know where you're currently based, which open source projects and communities you're affiliated with, and if you don't mind, provide a little highlight, something that's happened in your life since the pandemic, or your community's life since the pandemic. You'll need to unmute yourself. Okay, maybe Tomas, would you mind sharing with us?
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Hello. Let me just remove this thingy from my hair just a sec. So hi, I am Tomas. I am from the KD project, and I do think that open source is on my life for almost 20 years, and I do program professionally for open source on 16 of those years. There is one thing that I try to do as much as programming, that is to create communities and try to make people also do things on open source. So my wife hates me because of that, because usually I take my vacations, going to universities and teaching how to start contributing to open source. I've been doing this in Brazil for the past 10 years, and I'm also Google Summer of Code mentor for most of those years. Usually, I got in contact with professors on universities. I talk to them, I ask them if they like open source or if they don't, or if they actually know open source, because one thing that I discovered that's most of the universities, at least inside of Brazil, they don't actually understand what the hell open source means. They think that it's just software that it's free, but it's not that. I mean, we know open source, we know that it's much more than that. And then I go there and I talk to them, and then usually they allow me to do a 40-hour course for free. I've never charged for those, with the only intention of training the students on the tools that we use professionally and how to contribute to something. And this has been how I created the KD Brazil. When I say that I created the KD Brazil, there was a KD Brazil before me, but it was 3 members for 5 or 6 years. As soon as I started to do that, we grew to almost 50 members, and most of them are contributors, some with code. We have now around 12 contributors with code, but we have way more than that, contributors for translations and UX, for more projects than KD, because it's not because I am inside of the KD projects that I will only focus on KD software. So I've also pushed people to GNOME Foundation. I've also pushed people to Mono, and I really like how I am, how do I say, I really like the things that are happening because I have the time to go and do those things. This year, I actually want to talk to Regina because of this. I got a student from Maputo in Mozambique asking me if I could go there and do a course in Africa. And I said, of course, I just need a few days of vacation, and I am not even going to try to charge, because it would be my pleasure to teach for people outside of Brazil. And then I also got contacts from a teacher in Vancouver. And only because of Corona, I'm not doing those things this year. But as soon as Corona ends, I'm going there and I'm gonna try to start communities. Not waiting for them for that, because I've waited for someone to teach me how to start an open source for a long time. And it took me almost 4 years, with fears that people would laugh about my codes, with fears that I would be judged. So if you have somebody that already knows how to open source, take the time, go to universities, talk to teachers, talk to students, and see if the students are willing to use open source as their conclusion projects, because I've seen that this makes them quite happy to have more people looking at the codes, and it makes them happy because it would be a code that matters. Because usually, from what I saw, as soon as the student finishes his conclusion projects, he abandons it. So this makes everything better. And this is how I am trying to create communities. As soon as Corona ends, Africa, Vancouver, and also a university in India. And Nick, I think I talked to Nick and to somebody else about going to Delhi IT and doing the same thing there. So yes, this is my approach on building communities. Never waiting for them to want to start one. Going there and pushing the communities for them.
That's awesome. Well, if KDE Brazil is any example, I'm sure the upcoming communities will be just as thriving, given due time. Thank you, Tomas. I'd love to hear from Mustafa. Can you hear us? Are you able to unmute your mic? We'd love to get your introduction.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, hello. All right. Well, please give us a quick brief. Let us know where you're currently based, which projects and communities you're affiliated with, and maybe a brief highlight from the pandemic.
Good all. My name is Paulo. I'm working with Open Source Software Foundation. I'm also president of the Founder Foundation. Our activities is especially for.
I'm very sorry, Mustafa. Your connection seems to be breaking up quite heavily.
Yes. Can you hear now?
It's quite spotty.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
Yes. Can I continue?
Yes. It's really staticky. Just to be aware. But please continue.
If we continue, maybe production is okay. We can continue.
Okay, I think we might have lost Mustafa's audio. I do apologize. It seems like there are some technical difficulties today. Okay. Let's go on to the next question. Maybe Mustafa can find a better connection and jump back into the conversation. I'd love to move on to our first real question of the panel, digging deep into the topic. The question is, which Tomas started to answer already actually, how did you start your community and what were some of the challenges you faced? Is there any advice you would like to give to someone who is starting a new community?
Oh yes. Don't try to do a Linux distribution. We have already too many Linux distributions. Pick one and try to help the software, because we do have, for instance, on GNOME and on KDE that are big communities. I think we both are the combined biggest community on free software that there is. We have softwares that have 0 maintainers. So instead of trying to create your new Linux distro that will take the world by storm, pick a small application that it's abandoned and try to help, try to make it better. With that, you have people helping you to start, and things will be not as hard as if you are doing everything alone. Try to find professors and people that are within the community already. Try to push the idea towards your study group or your university. Usually they are open. Sometimes they are not really onto it, but usually it's because they don't know. And do not wait because there is nothing around there or there is no work based on open source near where you live. Because nowadays the work on IT is global. You can work whenever you want, wherever you want. Basically that. And don't be shy. It's important not to be shy. Yeah, if you are shy, you're not going to talk to people. If you're not going to talk to people, nobody will look at your codes. Your mistakes will be still the same mistakes that you did as a student because there is nobody to correct you. And don't be scared on people correcting your codes. I mean, I have 16 years of experience writing source codes. Sometimes my students, they find errors and they fix my codes, and I am so glad because people fixing my code means that I don't need to work on that.
Thank you. Well, I saw some head nods from Manuel and from Anika on your comment. Anika, would you like to follow up with that? I know you are doing lots of work with jumpstarting the KDE network. Maybe you can pull in some experience from there.
Sure. So we recently started KDE Network, but I think it has been very successful. And in India, Kerala, there were a lot of things happening, but we had no idea about it actually. So I feel that starting a new community is about finding the right people actually. If you find the right people, you can actually start a community, and if they are dedicated to it. Because I feel, if they do it for maybe, just 6 months and they just leave you, there's no point, because you want people with long-term commitment. And also not just one person. That's what we decided for KDE Network. Because if you just have one person, that person cannot start the community. You need at least 4 to 5 people so that, if somebody is busy, the other person can replace that. So in India, what we did is that we have around 5 people over there. And just as Thomas said, that, you need to connect to universities, but you need someone who can actually, understand the language of the community. I'm saying about not only the language in terms of language, but how they feel, their way of communicating, because that's how you can enter the community. Like also about the Nigeria thing, which Thomas mentioned. So I feel that if the people are not, if you're not connected to them, you cannot actually pursue the community. Also, I think when KDE started in 1996, the main thing which KDE was lacking was diversity. And now we have KDE Network in India, and hopefully we are starting in China as well. So I feel that, this diversity will actually create harmony, and it will bring a lot more people in the community. And the other point which I feel is that you need to accept the community, not only technical person and non-technical as well. So you need to create that awareness that we are just not about technical people, but also non-technical. Also, and sorry for the mask, because I'm actually in Hamburg at the Central City Station. So
Better to be safe than sorry, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you, Anika. Hong, and then Manuel, would you like to take it on?
Yeah, sure. Well, as teacher of university, I understand absolutely the words of Thomas. We are trying. The open source lab is located at Zacatecas State Science and Technology Council, like a government state. So we have from the council the approach or the close collaboration with all the universities of the state. So we have 3 challenges to start this big community right now. The first challenge is to have the trust of the universities, beginning with the teachers and going with the students, because there are the open source language, the open source philosophy here in Mexico is very low. So we work to try to get the trust of the students and the teachers. The second challenge was when we got the trust of the universities, teachers, and students. We worked to go to public the dependence of government, to private companies, to have the trust to develop projects around open source technologies. So, but right now we have working to reach, to ally with big leaders like Genome. I was just finished Genome Engagement Challenge from Genome. So this was an amazing experience for me, because we have more of 150 projects around from the maybe 50, 60 countries around the world. So I was see the very important philosophy of open source and at another countries, the other continents. I have the pleasure that I was being in Brazil sometimes. I was in Foz, I was in Porto Alegre. The community is big community, but the more important, the really matters around Brazil for me is the philosophy around open source. So it's a very big. How do you say? It's a very important goal for us to work to create this philosophy around open source here in Mexico. And I mean, like I'm a Genome member right now, I am working specifically to strengthen this community. So we have a lot of students, very talented students around the open source community, the open source lab community around country, and I think we have all the talent to start to work. We are working to develop a lot of projects. All the projects is developed with the open source technologies, but the next step is to work to take this talent to make a very important contributors to projects, to bigger projects, the open source projects like Genome, like KDE, like maybe Google. So, there are a lot of leaders, there are a lot of projects, there are a lot of strategies around open source projects. So we are working to take these young talents from universities and go to these big projects to make a more important community of contributors. And right now in Mexico, I forget the last chance, the pandemic. We have an amazing surprise, because every 6 months, before the pandemic, we was work with 140 students every 6 months. But our biggest surprise is when we go to the pandemic, to home office, to work from home, to this kind of very complex situation, the students follow coming to the open source lab, working home office, and we don't have less students every 6 months. We have the same production, we have the same community. It's very important for us, and the students is ready to work in this new model. It's very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Hung, would you like to answer the question, just in case you need it? How did you start your community? What were some challenges you faced at FOSS Asia? And what's some advice that you would give to someone starting a new community?
Yeah. Yes, so I hope you can hear me. Okay, good. So how did I start FOSS Asia? So back in 2009, so at that time, like the open source definition, the idea of open source is very new for a country like Vietnam. I'm originally from Vietnam, by the way. I also did not study computer science myself, but during university, I got involved in the Linux user group, and I got a lot of mentorship from the people from community, and I soon realized the opportunities with open source in developing country like Southeast Asia. Getting access to education is also challenging, and people don't get the same kind of education system that you get from the West, you know, and also very limited. People have access to internet at that time. So we see that with open source, there is a huge opportunity for people where they can collaborate, where they can learn, and also the best thing is that they can connect with people from all over the world, which is something that really hard for people in that particular region. So what I did in the beginning, my partner and I, he has many years working in open source. He originally come from Germany, moved to Asia in the past. So we started to think of creating a platform where people can meet, can exchange ideas. So we started the first event where we invite people from Europe, from the US to come over. We have GNOME. Actually, we hosted the GNOME Asia in 2009 in Ho Chi Minh City, and that was the first open source event ever in Vietnam. We got a lot of attendees, a lot of interest from the community. People come like exchange the idea, to share more about different tools, share more what is open source. And after that first event, people started to get together. So over more than like 11 years, we run the events every year, and when people meet, people get together. So then new idea coming. So over the years, Force Asia was not an event anymore. During the event, people exchange ideas, they develop new projects. So we now hosted a lot of open source projects on our Force Asia GitHub. We have about 4,000 contributors in our organization, a network of 30,000 people, even though from the beginning it was only 2 people. So we developed various open source software. We have event management, we have a search engine. We also look into AI technology. And I mentioned in the beginning, we developed an open source hardware product, which is the Pocket Science Lab, that enable students to learn electronics in a more interesting and portable way. Yeah. So that was the journey. I am not going to spend so much time talking about how we're getting here today, but what I want to say is a lot of challenges that we face along the way. But one thing that helps us to continue, that if you believe in something, continue doing something, that you persist with your idea, no matter if it's difficult, challenging, we will still try to connect with people and try to make things happen. One of the biggest challenges of Force Asia, and I think with many other open source projects and communities as well, is the resources. We do not have a big company who backing us, right? Sustainability is always a big issue. How can you manage to continue to develop the projects? Also the question of getting contributors on board. Annika already mentioned earlier about like how to try to engage different people. You need to speak their language. You need to be open and embrace diversity. And it's also very similar to the Force Asia community. And I think Rina mentioned in Africa, people have different motivation why they get engaged into the open source community. It's also similar to Asia. What are people motivation? We need to understand the people motivation. So when you come to developing country, all you want is to have a stable life, to take care of your family. We don't have a healthcare system here like in Germany or everywhere. So we need to understand what people need and show them the opportunity they can get with open source, building the trust in the community. So this is something that we believe that will that works over the year, and enable people to do more things, enable people to be independent, enable people to build skill that they can market themselves in the job market, enable them to earn a living, to sustain their life, so that they can continue contribute to open source. And we need to be prepared that people will leave at one point. So how you can get new generation to contribute is about what Manuel mentioned earlier, the education. So work with university. For several years, Force Asia connect with university in Vietnam, university in Singapore, India. We have several workshops across India. We have hackathons also in India and China. We work together with Tsinghua University in China. So it's really important to work with the local institutions. And I just want to add one more point. If you are thinking of starting a community, I want to reference what Thomas said earlier. don't just start a community. Think of what is your goal. Maybe it can be achieved already by being part of the existing community. Is not an easy task to do. So if you want to foster there's so many projects out there that you can contribute to. If you really have a specific goal that you want to achieve and no other existing communities can satisfy that goal, then think of like to start something. But it's not an easy start. Starting something is easy, but manage how to sustain is really difficult. Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of also good example if you want to look at. So here we met, like a lot of people mentioned the GNOME Foundation as an organization in Asia like us. We also be able to sustain for several years and continue to grow. We have our best practices available on the blog, on the website, and we're always happy to exchange and share more ideas. So our members are active also on GitHub if you want to find us. Yes.
Thank you. Maybe you can share any of those links in the chat or even the shared notes. That would be very helpful. Regina, would you like to answer the current question? How did you start your community? What were some challenges you faced? And what's some advice you would give?
Yeah, sure. I think it's quite exciting to listen to everyone, and there've been quite a number of good points that we made. So actually, the GNOME Africa started 2019, basically. I started when I joined the GNOME Foundation. I had been lecturing Linux for over 7 years before joining the GNOME Foundation. So I was already, I understood Linux. So finding people that had the same, that worked on the same platform that I've been, using to teach for a very long time was quite, exciting for me. But then I realized that when I came in, I was only introduced to, I think, about 2 Africans, which basically did not, at the time, was not a very good introduction for me, in a sense that we were few. And I wanted to have more Africans into the GNOME Foundation because I know it would, not just for diversity's sake, but also to, bring in, diverse ideas into the community. And so that's what actually formed the GNOME Africa community. And so at the time we started, I think it started first day I spoke about the GNOME desktop in an event, and I was quite excited to see the interest that people had for the GNOME desktop. And I just did basically something like a practical workshop in the event, and I showed people how it was easy to work with the GNOME desktop on the Linux platform, basically. And we know we got a lot of people that was interested to want to be part of the GNOME Foundation, and I think that's basically what started the GNOME Africa community. And so at the beginning, we had people of interest that came in, but then we had people of interest with less idea about what open source is in general, and about basically what GNOME is and what GNOME Foundation is. So for us at the time, it was more of introducing people to open source, introducing people to what GNOME is. And I would say first, starting the community is being very clear and direct about the roadmap of the community you're trying to build and where the community you're trying to create is going to. So GNOME Africa is definitely a branch of the GNOME Foundation. So we ensured that we were clear enough about the goals of GNOME Foundation. And what GNOME Africa is doing is basically extending the community into Africa, but we are all achieving the same goal. So we're always having to tell people that were coming to the community your contributions to open source. Basically it's contribution on the GNOME, maintaining GNOME projects and GNOME open source software. That's basically what it was. But then another thing is we had people. We took people the way they are. So basically, if you're not in technology, for example, you're not a computer science person, and you just have interests in open source, we're open to helping you grow and basically telling you what the community is about. So let me iterate by saying that the GNOME Foundation community, you would know, I've not really had much face in Africa, from onset. So we had so many things to do as to, you know, having people to feel part of the community and feel comfortable, acceptance basically in the community. What we did again basically was to always show people appreciation for the little for every contribution that they make. So we used most social media platform as a means to, you know, call out the names of those that, you know, that helped us to maybe social media or contributed to the GNOME Foundation project one way or the other. That allowed people to stay more in the community, you know, and has been able to create a kind of a level of sustainability for the community. What is the challenges? Basically, I would say is motivation in Africa is different from every part of the world. I think we should say that. And so if you need people to come to contribute to open source, people have real problems. So we need to look at projects basically that are going to help people compensate them for their contribution. And so that's for, I think, for some time slowed us down a little bit. So because we needed to begin to do stuff that begin to do projects, something like outreach, you know, something that would help people, you know, get the type of motivation they need, that would help them go through the normal life and pay bills at the same time, contribute to open source. So right now we are launching into universities in Africa. We just started the application process basically, and we're quite excited at the numbers of people that are willing to be ambassadors for GNOME in their universities, and we're looking to work out a way that would, have to, create a platform where they would understand what the GNOME Foundation is. So again, for us basically in the community, is more of continuing to show people the roadmap to the community. How do you join? How do you contribute? What is the benefit of your contributions? What are the different aspects you can contribute to? It may be code, it may be translation, we just always have to do this over and over again to let people know. And it might never be because we're just starting. It might never be enough at the moment. We have to keep doing this. As regards to another thing I think that we did last year that happened well, although I don't have like a full update on that, but I can talk about what the scalable onboarding project, basically started by Sri and some other members, inclusive me, but I've not really been there for quite some time since I relocated. So basically, it's like creating a kind of a platform, metrics that helps people to basically onboard newcomers to onboard properly into the not just GNOME as a whole, but basically open source projects. And this is another way to kind of help newcomers basically to come into the open source community. So another thing that is very important that I'm quite let me use the word passionate about is sustainability of the project basically, and how well the project can scale above current members to new contributors that are coming up. So one of the initiative that we're driving, again, it's the university initiative, which basically one way we can scale easily in Africa, and we can bring sustainability into the project and have more newer people join the community. So would that be, do we have challenges at the moment? Or yes, we have quite a number of challenges. I've mentioned a few, and that's basically coming up with projects. We hope that there will be more projects like Outreachy, where people can actually get compensations for open source contributions, and more projects like Manuel says, like the education project we did with GNOME, which is basically a very good project. So we need more of those type of projects, basically in open source, to help people from diverse communities join the open source, and we get more diverse ideas from that part. Another challenge we are having is basically having to talk more and build a platform for how people can understand what GNOME is about as regards documentation and all of that. So what we are doing in GNOME Africa at the moment is to try to create a platform, more like a platform for GNOME Africa, where we have like a very, very videos and pictorial sequence of how the GNOME Africa was created, and the contributions that different people from Africa is making at the moment. and have that documented in a way that when a new applicant comes into community, we can tilt them to the platform and they could see the roadmaps and to be easy for them to basically come into community. Because like I think Manuel mentioned, GUM Foundation is big, KD is big, and so there are quite a whole lot of projects that can be contributed to. And sometimes one can get lost in the old roadmap and not knowing basically where to start and all of that. So we're trying to make sure that for the GNOME African community, we create a platform that allows people to easily come in and they don't get lost in the crowd, and they know where to start, and they know who to reach out to and who to speak to at any point in time. So I think that's basically where we are at the moment with the issue with sustainability. So I think overall in general is basically ensuring that we're making projects that creates conversation, ensuring that we're building type of project that allows people to scale outside the users. I mean the people that started the community, to newer people taking up challenges and all of that. So these are basically what we are doing at the time. We're doing that early because we want to create the right foundation for the GNOME Africa community.
Right. Thank you. Well, Mustafa, let's see if we can get a little bit from you. Let us know where you're based, which organization and projects you're affiliated with, and how did you start your community? I see your mic is on. I see we might not have Mustafa here anymore. Okay. Unfortunately, it looks like he did drop the call again. I'd like to then introduce our next question, being, where are there opportunities for all of us to collaborate and increase users and revenue for Linux apps?
I think as a FOSS community, we are already collaborating really well. But I feel that, among us, we should not have any competition. It's not the real stats, but I'm just saying assume stats that the market share which proprietary softwares have is approximately 95%, and we might have only 5%. So I think rather than, competing for 5%, we should all compete for the 95%, and we should support each other, I feel, in this journey. And I think for revenue, we can always do that. Rather than having a plain page of donations, we create small donation pages. For example, my previous background has been that I have worked for a lot of not-for-profit organizations. So what they used to do was they had emotional impact. So maybe, creating a page where you can say that you donate for an educational app that is creating impact in a government school. For example, right now we are working with public schools in Kerala, and you have the stats at how poor they are. So using those stats actually for more donations on your page can help you to increase revenue, because we are not selling, we do not have advertisements, we are not selling the data, so we don't have any other way to actually earn the money. This is the only way we can actually, earn more donations. And we need to create the impact that no donation is a small donation. Maybe, a lot of people think that I'm not a big company. Even individual donations are appreciated, and we should, somehow change our page, and we should say that these are the numbers of the individual contributors. I think I've covered the points, but if I missed anything, let me know, Alison.
Yeah, so I just want to say that I really like the point Anika mentioned about competition inside the community. So rather compete among each other, work, support each other. And I think the most practical way how we can support each other is use each other product. So if people in the open source community develop something, use it. A lot of people go out there talk about open source, but they don't actually use open source themselves. Yeah, so if I organize an event, I have an option, I will use an open source system. So it's nice that we use Big Blue Button here to to run this event. So I also like use, instead of use Photoshop, let's use GIMP. So how can we make sure that we use the application that developed by our inner circle rather than proprietary software if we have an option? And another thing that I want to add here, donation is one model of getting funding for open source project, but this is not the only model. Yeah, and also like community, you also Dorina mentioned about compensation to the developers. So not everyone can afford to join to compensate the developer, or not all the project will be accepted into outreach. So we need to constantly think of different commercialization model, how people can earn an income. There are a lot of research out there that showing people can earn money by offer support around open source application. So what we are missing in the ecosystem, we develop a software application. A lot of people, developers like Thomas, like to write code. You spend a lot of time on make the super nice application. A lot of things related to very technical topic, but one thing that we often missing is how to enable the user. Yeah, and a lot of, so when you try to convince a company to use an open source application, they often ask for, or do you have offer to support the companies, onboarding them, or any maintain of the service, administration of the service. Often open source projects do not have a model where they can offer support to companies or to more like to government sector, for instance. So anyway, what I try to say is that helping each other by using each other product inside the community, and think of a way to commercialize your project, offering support or sell the software as a service. Of course, it's not so easy, but we certainly need to think of a way how to earn an income, and also how to pay our developers. At the Force Asia, for example, we also constantly think of different models, how we can get the funding rather than depending on donation. We distribute hardware open, so the hardware that we produce completely open source, but people do like buy the hardware online to have the project to sustain. And one thing that I also feel a little bit sad. So for instance, even we understand how difficult it is to sustain an open source community, a lot of us still really hesitate to pay for open source product. So people would, so either the proprietary software by default we have to pay, but why do we have to pay for open source? And I think this is the mindset that we need to change.
That's fantastic, and I love how both you and Anika have kind of agreed and expanded on each other's points. Manuel, please go ahead.
Yeah, this all the talking about Congress is amazing. Here in Mexico, we are working to create new companies, little companies of technologies and innovation projects of innovation with technologies focused with philosophy open source. Right now, we have maybe 15 new companies, little companies created by the students, which works at the open source lab community, and right now is selling or getting paid for your knowledge. The mindset, the basic mindset is to change the way to see the projects with open source projects, because we like open source technology users or developers, we can't see the projects like a product. We must to see the projects like a services, and we must to get to make invoice to get money from our knowledge. I think the open source is a very good opportunity to create a new business model, to work to create a new companies, a new economic model to estrange the actual economic model around the companies specialized in technologies. So it's it's very important to take the young talents and to take to the new companies and to get all the talent to create new business model around open source technologies. So this I totally agree with Hong, and we must to approach to the young talent to get the trust to create our own companies. I think is the main way. Here at Zacatecas, here at Mexico, we have all the support from government, but we don't have thinking only is the only way to support or to finance our project. We must to try to create a new way to strengthen this kind of models, and the new economic model, new model of business with the open source is a very good opportunity for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Tomas, would you like to take it from here?
I mean, the things that I would say, it would be a little bit repetitive because I went too fast on my first iteration, and I think I already said this, but I would completely agree with everything that Manuel had said, and also with Hong Fuk. I really don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm truly sorry. And Manuel, I actually want to ask you if we could try to get a few people on Mexico, not just GNOME, and then try to do what I said, go to some university and do a course for the teachers, for the professors, and for the students. I would gladly spend a few $1,000 and fly to there and ask for my bosses to give me a vacation just so I could do that.
Thomas, so my name is Hong Phúc, and it has a Chinese origin. It means blessing. If it's too difficult for you, you can call me Hong. It's also okay. So in the Chinese way, yeah. So in the Chinese way, it's Hong Phu. I have a Chinese grandfather. In Vietnamese.
Oh, that's awesome. The meaning is so better than mine. My name means a drunk guy.
Yeah, so often Asian name is always associated with a meaning. Yeah, so you can call me Hong if that is easier for you. No problem.
It's a little bit, yes. Thank you, Hong.
No problem.
Well, this is great. Really, this was even a better learning for me than the rest of the discussion. I love hearing people's names in their native tongue. Manuel, what do you say about Tomas's proposition?
Thomas, please come on. We can start to create the strategy to work together or to make this kind of collaboration is very important for us. We work every day to try to approach to reach the alliance with the leaders, with the specialists, but the most important thing for us is with people like you that knows with trying to teach and to take the knowledge to university is a very good strategy. I am teacher of university, Thomas. So I know what is the more important I don't know requirement to get all the talent to the FOSS project, to the FOSS communities like our community. So Thomas, Hong Fog, and everyone, please, you are welcome to Open Source Lab community. And it's a very good for us if you can work together with us and let us to work together to take all resources to help you to every kind of strategy that you have. So please come on, Thomas. You're welcome. Everyone, every time you want. Sorry, thank you.
Amazing. Well, before we segment over to the questions in our shared notes, because I think those are very much worth asking, because we do have about 10 minutes remaining. Regina, would you like to add any additional comments to our question being, where are there opportunities for all of us to collaborate and increase users and revenue for Linux apps? Keeping in mind, we do only have about 10 minutes. Okay, that's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do have one application that is trying currently to join a broader community named Wired Panda. This application was started by a professor doing his master's on a university in Brazil. The problem is that the application is actually awesome, and he does not know what to do with the awesomeness that the application is. So I'm gonna try to write here try to remember the name of the website. And I am just pasting this here on the chat. It is wiredpanda.org. We are looking for people right now, for universities, to adopt the software and make it grow, because this is an awesome software to teach about, wires and logic circuits. And we are trying to create a little bit of network around this application.
Fantastic. Okay, let's go to our questions from our audience. First question is, what do the panel think about creating or joining a LUG? I'm sorry, don't know how I'm supposed to pronounce this one.
I guess, is it the Linux user group or on?
I'm assuming yes, Linux users group, and thank you for whoever just typed it in.
So I think the first thing would be to do not use abbreviation, because people from different regions might not understand what we mean. So I think that we should always spell out the word. This is the first thing we should do. And to answer to that, should I just go ahead? Yeah. Okay. So what do you think about creating or joining? So I will highly recommend it. So a few years back, whenever I travel to a new city, the first thing I would look for the Linux user group. I remember one time I traveled to Johannesburg in South Africa. So I contact someone in the Linux user group. I met him, and later on he came to the Force Asia Summit in Singapore, and we have the connection there. If you reach out to people and say that you come from similar background, they always welcome you. And when I first learned about on open source, it also come from the Linux user group in my university, where people helped me to install Ubuntu for the first time in my machine. Unfortunately, it was very popular a few years back. Is it coming from here? So I think I heard some background noise. It's not for me. I'm in a very far quiet room. A few years back, right, Linux user group were very popular, but not so much recently, because there's so many new technologies. So people create user group around a certain technology, and not so big about Linux user group in general anymore, but more on the distribution level. For instance, you see Ubuntu user group also like very popular everywhere. So it's not like before. In the beginning, I remember like 12, 15 years ago, it's always about the first contact would be the Linux user group in different cities, but now that generation, they're getting older, so they're not so engaged and not so how to say active anymore. But younger generation who form around specific technology, specific Linux distribution are become more popular. And I also want to mention here, I see in the core is Yongbin, which is very active. So he also one of the core member of the Ubuntu user group in South Korea. I'm very glad that I see him here. You know that South Korea is the city. Normally we don't know so much about what's going on there, but they're very active in many ways. And to answer this question, yes, think about joining. I don't know if it's now still the trend to create a new Linux user group anymore, but there's so many other. If you are interested in one distribution, go find the user group for that distribution or for a certain technology and join them. Highly recommended. Okay, yeah. So I think that's it, the first question.
Yeah, just opening it up. Does anyone else want to add? If not, happy to move on to the next question. We have a couple more. Second question says, what do you think about using languages other than English in FOSS communities for user support, development, and other purposes? This asker says, I have encouraged this, but ironically got pushback from people whose native language is not English.
I would like to answer that question.
Please go ahead.
Because we started in India, and Kerala has their own state language, which is Malayalam. So of course people do understand English over there, but it was not easy. So what we have done is that we have all the documents in English, and we have asked the local translator to translate that. Similarly, we are going to do the same thing for China as well. We are going to ask the local people to actually translate that for us in China. So you have to, as I said before, that you have to speak their language. That's the only solution. Because you just have to spread the awareness about Linux. You don't have to force them to actually understand English.
Thank you, Anika. Would anyone else like to add anything to Anika's statement? And again, she was mentioning how we have to adapt to the local language.
So, yeah, Brazil has a really low entry on English. Most of Brazilians, they don't understand English even when they are taught English. The English is really basic. One thing that I'm doing on the KD Brazil community, we are translating everything. We are doing everything in Portuguese. And I am also in contact with two English teachers that are open source users, and they are doing free lessons for a few of the members. And we are fixing or improving software for them as a reward or something. So we are trying to help each other out, making one of those silly Hollywood movies where one people helps another, and then another helps another, and then another helps another.
Well, thank you. I'll keep myself brief. There's a bunch of noise outside my window, so I apologize. Would anyone else like to add? Maybe Regina, would you like to add anything? You are needing to rejoin the audio.
Yeah, so while waiting for Regina, I can also mention that in the FOSS Asia community, we organize several technical meeting in Hindi, as we have a lot of contributors in India. When they work together, I can see that they organize their tech stand-up and the regular technical alignment in their local language. So I think it's also we encourage people to speak in their own language. That definitely plus make people feel more comfortable. And one thing that I also learned from Yongbin, the organizer from the Ubuntu group in South Korea, he also recommended several times that instead of speaking to each other on the video call, maybe it's easier for people to type. So even though it's less efficient to type and to speak, but some developers more comfortable with using writing English rather than speaking it also. Yeah.
Absolutely makes sense. Regina, do you want to let us know how English language is affected in African communities? What are your thoughts on using languages other than English for user support, development, and other purposes?
Can you hear me now? Excellent. Sorry, I had issues with network, so I was going back and forth. Okay, I think that it's a very good, this is my opinion now, I think that it's a very good thing to have other languages. Translation basically in open source project excites me a lot. Basically, if you have translation of projects in different languages, basically not African, now, but other types of
languages, and I think it helps to bring in on board new contributors into open source projects. But in Africa, it's something that I would love to see, that we have different languages in Africa. The GNOME project being translated in different languages in Africa is something I would love to see. But yeah, again, it's like I stated earlier when I was speaking, one of the things is basically roadmap to how these things have been done prior to now, which basically at the moment, it's not so clear as to how translations of open source projects are being done. I would love to see basically do a little bit of more research on other open source projects and see how they've done well with translations. And it would be, very nice to imbibe that in the GNOME Africa community, basically in the GNOME project as a whole, since we basically are working to see that there's more visibility for the GNOME project. So yeah, I think it's a very good initiative.
Great, thank you. We are nearly out of time. I would love to at least get the next question out in the world for everyone. It is, how is the open source software trying to call out for companies so they are more attracted to use non-proprietary software? Also, how is open source handling the demands that most of the proprietary software can handle? Many times we want to use open source software, but they just can't keep up with the features of proprietary software. Therefore, companies will pay for the proprietary software instead.
Why the companies are not also paying for the open source software to develop themselves? I mean, if the only problem is money, they can hire developers to do the job and improve.
Yeah, so yes, the answer is we cannot compete. We just don't have enough money. We are not Google. We are not Microsoft. How can we invest further into like all open source software? But it doesn't mean that we don't have a way to succeed. So earlier we mentioned about offer support for open source around open source software as a service to offer to companies. So a lot of companies do not make a decision on using an open source because they hesitate of the support system. Do they get support to get a meditation service from open source application? And another thing, how we can encourage, I think here in Europe, and it will be soon happening everywhere around the world, like the legislation, the government starts to embrace open source. So if we have something coming from the government level that encourage and provide more embrace open source more, I think companies will also started to look into open source. In Europe, there are a lot of funding for companies who want to develop or start open source. I'm also part of the Open Source Business Alliance Europe. So these are a network of companies that doing that develop open source application or using open source. I think we need more like this. So companies get together, and if it change on the government level, where more adoption of open source being embraced everywhere, it also change the ecosystem. How many software, but they can't keep up. Yeah. So I think that chapter. Yeah.
Just one thing. Increasing on what Hank said, those companies that do not work on open source, they are also using open source a lot, like really a lot. Probably their web servers are running Linux. Probably their web services are running PHP. Probably there is something on Python involved. Their routers are running Linux. Their phones are running a kernel on Linux. So yes, they are using a lot. But why they are not spending a little bit trying to improve? Free software does not just means that you can get it for free, but people are working on that. And people need to get paid to work on that on their not free time. I work in a company that luckily allows me to do open source for a living. But when I'm not working on open source, I'm also working for open source because for me it's fun, but for a lot of people it's not fun. And they can't stay on the computer on a weekend.
Yeah.
So you need to, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's more like a chicken and egg problem. So in order to compete with the feature set of the variety of software, we need to have the funding. Before we have the funding, we need to get somebody to pay for open source application. And in order to get somebody to pay for open source application, we need to make sure that we offer the services. We need to pay people so that we can offer the services around our software to the business. Yeah, but I think with the current development, and of course, we did not have a chance to go to another question when we discussed about how the pandemic influenced the FOSS ecosystem. I think, of course, it's not good, the pandemic, but it also opened up a lot of opportunities where people see how important it is to be transparent, to be collaborative, to be open, to develop better solution altogether. So I think this is the right time, and this is also the opportunity for us. We see a lot of open source application in health, like being developed during the pandemic, and they are more in different industry. Yeah, and I have a high hope and also very positive for the future of FOSS ecosystem, even though it is challenging.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, our next talk begins in 10 minutes. There is only one more question left. If you all are happy to give it a quick answer, I'm happy to give us the time for it. So I'll take silent yes. The final question from our audience is, what success story can you share on a self-sustaining project that you have been involved with or influenced? I see there's a link being put into the notes.
Yes.
Well, would you like to, or Hong, Tomas, Regina?
I think both GNOME and KDE are a really good example of a self-sustainable software. I mean, GNOME is used on really huge Linux installs from the Red Hat, that it's a really expensive Linux. Red Hat is more expensive than Windows Server, and it's used there. So just to show that free software does not mean that it's gratis. And KDE is up and running since 96, 97. I mean, it's more than 25 years. There is a lot of people that are working today on KDE that could have been a KDE son if KDE was a person. And this is self-sustainable. They are, I think, just too big to fail now, even if they are not like a company that deals with currency. They don't actually need currency to keep up, but they do need a little bit of currency just to make people together once or twice a year, because it's much better to work with your colleagues by your side.
If I may,
okay, okay.
So I also put in the two projects that I directly involved. It's under the FOSS Asia community. So the first project is a hardware project, the Pocket Science Lab. So it's been developed for about 4 years now and being sustained. So we have different ways to sustain the two projects. So the Pocket Science Lab, we sustain this project through like different source of funding. We work together with the EU on the Horizon 2020, and we also get funding from different programs where they have to grow the open source hardware ecosystem, and we also offer the product. So the board that we make, we sell on different channels. So distribution in China, in the US and Europe, everywhere. So selling the device into a way to get an income to pay for the development. So this is the first project. The second project is an event management system. Event.ua, this is also entirely open source, and the model how we can sustain this Event.ua is to similar to Eventbrite or not a commercial service. So people pay for open source community. If you don't sell a ticket, you don't pay. But if you want some kind of like commercial sales ticket, so we charge on commission, like for a small commission when you earn an income. And I think this is also like often seen model for many software. Yeah, so you pay when you also get an income for your event. This is the two projects and two different funding model that I've been directly involved with.
Let me just add to that. Basically, I think just to expand on the GNOME Foundation project, basically, looking at the GNOME Foundation project when it started, apart from it being self-sustained from funding that we get, basically you would see that the GNOME Foundation also have a way of creating legacy programs, basically, that allows it to continue to sustain itself. For example, projects like the outreach that came out from GNOME, and now we are running the educational challenge as well. And GNOME Foundation is basically still, looking at other ways to scale as well to bring up sustainable projects. So I think sustainability, if we look at it in a more diverse way, it's the project is not relying basically on what it has been fed with for over 20 years. The project is expanding itself to other aspects of the world globally, and I think that's one of the exciting thing about the GNOME Foundation project, basically.
Manuel, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. I think the very important projects. I am using Linux from 1996 with the first edition, the first version of Mandrake. I think absolutely I agree with Thomas, and KDE was the first GUI graphical interface for the Linux. But I want to share. I think here in Zacatecas, around the open source lab, we are getting this the trust from the government, and right now at government of the state of Zacatecas, we have maybe 10 biggest projects, 10 more important projects for government, which are developed with the technology of open source technologies. So I think it's a very proud for us because our projects which don't have the government don't have to pay expensive money, because we are working from open source lab. But the more important is our guys or students which develop this project is working for government, like support, like technical background to this kind of project. So it's more important because they go to the government and working for this specifically for this project, together with this project are working to develop maybe 5 or 6 another projects for this instance from government. So I think the model open source lab may get impact to the government. Right now, we was starting to try to adopt and to migrate to use open source at government, but it's a utopia, because it's very complex, the market around open source around in technologies. So, but we are right now, we have at government maybe 95% of our infrastructure of government are working with open source technologies, and I am sure it's a very good, it's a very good impact, it's a very good benefit for the government, and it's very important for us. So we are working, we will work to make more projects, but in the same way, we must work to create new companies with open source technologies, with new talents, with new entrepreneurs creating or these own companies. I think this is that. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you all. Really a big round of applause for each and every one of you today for joining us and being a panelist here. I think your insights were absolutely wonderful, and it was great to hear some background about your respective communities. Again, cannot thank you enough for joining us, and we hope you get to enjoy the final couple of talks here at LAS. If not, have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy your day. And for our viewers, we will be back in just a minute.
Thank you
We'll be
so
back
much. Yeah.
Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
really my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very
For our
much.
viewers,
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Thomas. Everyone. Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you all so very much. For our viewers, we will get started with our second to last talk at LAS in just 1 minute, so stay tuned. Hi, Richard. Welcome. I'll just ask you to rejoin the audio before we get started.
Richard, need to rejoin with my. Okay.
Let's try now.
Wonderful.
Yes, go ahead.
And
Okay, we are listening now. Richard Hughes. Please
ready to go?
start. Yes, start.
Excellent. Well, hello everybody. My name is Richard Hughes. I work for Red Hat on emerging technologies and desktop stuff and firmware stuff. And I was asked by Sri and Alison to give a talk about how to basically build an ecosystem. On the logic is that I've worked on this stuff for like 5 years now. We've managed to get companies to care about Linux users where perhaps they haven't in the past. And there's an awful lot of overlap between a firmware ecosystem and an app ecosystem. Right, let's do next slide. So, the basic problem we were trying to solve 5 years ago is that users just weren't updating firmware. Firmware is not this thing anymore that is just a kind of like add support for new CPUs and that kind of stuff. It's actually security critical. It's like an OS underneath your OS. And so not updating firmware is a security a nightmare. So the problems were fourfold. People didn't know what hardware they had installed, whether it was an NVMe drive, an ATA drive, etc. They didn't know updates were available. So they didn't go to support.dell.com on a monthly basis and search for their serial numbers and stuff. And even if they could get hold of them, a lot of the vendors were supplying the files just from random, well, literally FTP sites with, if you were lucky, an MD5 checksum without any kind of certificates or any sort of assurance that the firmware hadn't been tampered with in some way. And then even if you did manage to find the firmware, it might be that you were not allowed to apply it. So a good example here is I have a LG monitor I use, and the only way you can update the firmware is using Windows XP or Windows 7. It doesn't work on Windows 10. Or I have a Lenovo server which has Xclarity on it, and that only works in RHEL 7, doesn't work in RHEL 8 or RHEL 9. So even if you manage to find the update, and it might be that the vendor that you bought the laptop from, if you had bought the unifying receiver at the same time from the Dell laptop, it might be that you had to go to 2 different vendors to find the firmware, and then it wouldn't apply anyway. And so the consequence of this is people just weren't doing firmware updates, which is something that my boss said this needs fixing. So what did we do? I built 2 projects. The LVFS is essentially the web app, and it's basically the metadata source of both the firmware and the list of firmware. And the idea is the only people that you have to use the LVFS are the ODMs, the OEMs, that kind of thing. People like, I don't know, Dell, Lenovo, etc. And everyone else just downloads a shared metadata catalog of all the different firmware that's available. And then the other side of the project is once you have all that high quality metadata, you need to be able to apply it onto your hardware. So I guess in the same way you can sort of relate this back down to like FlatHub and the local like libflatpak scenario, where you need a mechanism to actually install the data onto your computer. And so FWLibD is a project that I think it's got about 34 different protocols now, and there's another sort of 5 in development, where you can just take a blob of firmware and blit it to an NVMe or ATA or Wacom or VIA, or there's just dozens of different vendors that have all these different bespoke protocols. And then I guess unlike maybe like how Snap and Flatpak work, we kind of close the circle back. So we have this idea of you report status optionally, and it's completely opt-in, where if the update went well, you might report the status back to the LVFS just with a sort of Boolean success. But if it failed for some reason, you get lots of system debugging, so that if there was a substantial number of failures coming back for a certain firmware, you can kind of work out that the firmware is failing because, I don't know, the kernel version is too old. And so the fix there would be to go back into the firmware on the RBFS and add an extra requirement to say the firmware must be at least this new, otherwise don't suggest it. And it's a really good way of kind of working out issues. So when we first started, we had all these issues where, I don't know, Debian had a really old libUSB version, which would trigger a bug which wasn't triggered in like all the things we were testing on, like Ubuntu, Fedora, etc. It's really useful. Like I say, it's completely opt-in, but it meant we could close the site. It also means I could sleep well at night, because if a bad firmware goes out, it means that it's automatically demoted from the public back to being private again if it fails more than a certain number of times. So if it fails below, say if it increases like 1% error rate or something, it automatically gets demoted back down. So it's kind of a bit more exciting than maybe an FTP site would be. So actually looking at the architecture, this is, I guess, fairly similar. Actually, what FWLibD does is probably not super interesting for this audience, but it's essentially like what Snap and Flatpak or PackageKit are doing. Essentially, I have 3 layers. You have the internet layer with the LVFS as the kind of the download server, and then you have this dumb CDN. The middle layer is the session, which might be something like GNOME Software, Appa, the KDE Software Center, or even the command line, FWLibD MGR. And one of the things that was interesting in this is we're analysing the user agents that were actually requesting firmware. 99% of the downloads were being done using a GUI client rather than 1% being done using command line, which is a real surprise for firmware. So we had to make it beautiful and think about UX all the time. Now, I put in the notes that it optionally downloads metadata from the LVFS. The idea here is you don't have to use the LVFS. Lots of companies don't use, if you're a 3-digit US agency, none of your servers have internet access. And so you might be getting the downloads, the metadata and the firmware themselves from an NFS share or a Samba share or something. And so it's not essential that you use the internet sort of side of things. The lowest bit, the system service, is FWMGR, and that's basically enumerating. So in the app ecosystem, you'd be saying what apps are already installed, and actually lets you add and remove apps that are sort of specified from something like FlatHub or firmware from the LBFS. Yeah, so I guess the main comment here is people will ask all the time, like, why didn't I write this in Go? Why didn't I write this in Rust? And 5 years ago, those ecosystems were even more immature than they are now. And the other thing is people who are actually writing the code to flash the firmware are probably firmware engineers. And lingua franca in firmware world is C. So it was ridiculous to choose any other language that wasn't C if you're going to be asking people to contribute to your project who are potentially firmware engineers. Of course, C is kind of pretty clunky, and it's not particularly nice to use without the sort of synthetic sugar of something like glib, and using something like gobject, which is kind of a nice, easy sort of middle ground between not using C++, but still having object-oriented programming sort of techniques, meant that we kind of had the best of both worlds, where we could say to people, this is how you use Gera and gobject stuff, but also get the C programmers to contribute to our project, which I'll come into is kind of important. Yeah, the other side of it was the website. So I'm not a web developer, and the idea of the LBFS right from the start was to be as simple as possible. There was no, I didn't want to spend time building the stack and writing the stack. And astronaut, I call it architecture astronauting, where it's like you've specified this thing as a microservice architecture that can be run by 1 billion people or whatever. The initial version of the RVFS was just a website. I think it was even written in PHP or something. It was pretty rubbish. And you could just upload files, which would be decompressed. The metadata was all smashed together, and that was basically it. And then from that, it organically grew to whatever we needed, rather than trying to do everything before. It kind of works quite differently to Microsoft Update as well. So I'm kind of keen on the privacy stuff here. So the way Windows Update works is you have you do a request and it enumerates all the hardware on your PC, and it sends all that information about your hardware and what firmware versions are installed up to one of the big servers in Microsoft somewhere, on their banks and banks of servers processing these requests. And then depending on the rule engine that's running on the servers, it'll send you a bespoke reply back that says you need to install this update, grab it from here. That's great if you have banks of servers and you don't mind sort of sending your hardware details to a third party, but not something that I wanted to do. And so the way we did it, we had everyone just downloading the shared metadata catalog. So everyone downloads exactly the same file from a dumb CDN. So I could have, I don't know, like 10 million people a week were downloading this file initially, and it was costing me $20 because everyone's just downloading off this geo-replicated CDN. And it also meant I had no idea of what hardware people were running, because it was just everyone was requesting the same thing. The only way you could sort of find out is what firmware they were requesting, but that's kind of required anyway. The flip side of that is we did a centralized firmware distribution. So everyone downloaded the metadata, but as soon as you wanted the firmware itself, you had to download that from the LBFS. Now, kind of the textbook way, the textbook reason for doing that is if there was a problem with the firmware, or it needed re-signing, or there was some sort of modification to it, we wouldn't have to invalidate CDNs around the world, and we could pull it straight away with no delay. But really, it's statistics. Because if we go to a big OEM and say something like, hey, there's a lot of Linux users who run lots of different computers and they've downloaded probably quite a few updates, it's a lot less compelling than someone saying, hey, there's 10 million users hitting this website per day and we've delivered, 28 million downloads since we started for 2,500 different bits of hardware. Once you sort of give them exact numbers, that's a lot more compelling to the likes of Dell, Intel, HP, etc. That sort of takes attention, and there's no real way of sort of putting all these files on some mirror somewhere and then have any idea of how effective and if your system's actually working. Also, randomly about the sign, it's a really good way of sort of mental health point of view as well, because I get emails maybe, I don't know, once a day, twice a day, saying you've done it wrong, this is bad, you should use this language, you should have done this instead, you should have used React, you should have done this, that and the other. And you look at the sign and you think, well, actually, the number keeps going up. So that's kind of like proves that something's going well. So it's kind of like a nice sort of mental health kind of balance on that. And we just turn on the mic. Is that better? Maybe I should just stop getting so excited and stop shouting. Cool, no worries. Right, so the other thing is with the web app, I didn't want to be spending time writing middleware service. Like the whole intention of this was to get firmware updates to end users as quickly as possible. So I chose an existing high-level language. Doesn't have to be hugely performant. It's probably being used by 3 or 4 ODMs simultaneously, which is nothing from a web app point of view. And everything else is being geo-replicated on the CDN. So I chose Python. It's using Flask as a kind of a high-level, kind of like a abstraction layer, and SQL Alchemy as kind of an ORM, which is probably horribly inefficient, but works really well, and it's certainly good enough and easy to use from my point of view. So my point is, there's no need to architecture everything for sub 1 millisecond response time when it doesn't matter. And the whole point of the architecture is to get firmware updates to users, or in LES's point of view, we want to get applications to end users. We don't sort of care about the plumbing. So I spent a lot of time, this is what, 2015, emailing an awful lot of companies, probably, I don't know, 300 or 400 different companies, basically saying, hey, I'm Richard, I work at Red Hat. I've developed this system for installing firmware on devices. I've got this website which you can upload firmware to for Linux users. Are you interested? And generally the response was either, we don't care about Linux users, or yeah, kind of maybe sounds interesting. But the most common one was, we're already customers with Red Hat, we're partners with Red Hat already. Can we switch to your Red Hat email and talk about stuff under NDA? Now, obviously working for a big company like Red Hat, it is, I guess there's negatives and there's positives as well. But in setting up something like this, it was hugely, hugely beneficial, because I could talk to the Logitechs, the Wacoms, the Intels, the HPs, the Dells, and they knew that Red Hat were doing this thing rather than some random bloke, as I was described by Microsoft as some bloke who works in his shed, which is kind of true, but maybe not in the spirit of things. So a lot of people were talking about this stuff as a good thing that came from Red Hat rather than some random person. Although the kind of the subtext here is that a lot of the maybe the first 3 years of the RVFS, it was running on a little HP microserver underneath my stairs on my broadband, which is a point I'll come to in a minute. So let's look at the last timeline. So we started 2015-16, and the first company was Hughes, which is a company that I happen to run, which produced the ColorHug hardware. And that was kind of like the first testing, sort of the real test for it, because we had like an actual legitimate legal company, and we had a device that we'd have a custom flashing protocol with a flashing file format and that kind of stuff. And that was like a really good first test. We could get it into Fedora, test it, does the architecture work, does the dbus interface work, what import export tools do we need, etc. And then the next step was talking to the people that could help me with this stuff, the people that would help me bootstrap this stuff. And it turns out open source hardware is awesome, because the sort of people that are producing open source hardware are producing low volumes of things, and they're highly technical people. So something like, I don't know, USB smart charger for something, they might only produce 200 per year, and they currently host the firmware updates on some, I don't know, some random FTP site with no signing, no MD5, whatever. And if you say, look, I've got this free service, it kind of probably works for a use case. And it's completely free, and we'll do signing, and we'll manage all the UI and the command line stuff for Linux users. They were like, that sounds awesome, it's less for me to do. And also they were the sort of people that if something was missing, that a feature they needed, either as a flashing protocol or in the website, they'd submit a patch, which was sort of awesome. And it was like a really good way to kind of kickstart the entire ecosystem. 2017, Dell were approached me sort of through Red Hat and said, look, we're thinking of doing this thing, which sort of similar to what the LVFS was, but it makes way more sense for us to collaborate because we don't want to be in the sort of the business of maintaining a web service. So maybe we could work together. And so Dell added support very quickly for their XPS line, IoT line, that kind of thing, edge stuff. And that was great. The problem is when you're an early adopter, you've got to do an awful lot of the work. So Dell wrote like the Synaptics MST plugin, the Thunderbolt plugin, and did a lot of the work with the UFI Capsule plugin, which incidentally was written initially by Peter Jones. So he kind of absorbed his project, sort of, I guess, claimed the credit for it. But it meant that Dell did an awful lot of work initially. Logitech got hit by a security issue called Mousejack in 2018, and their hardware was basically being pulled out of data centers and stuff because you couldn't apply firmware updates if you're running RHEL. And so they kind of forced to join the LVFS and push updates out using FWD. And they added support for their unifying hardware. And it's like they only uploaded maybe, I don't know, a dozen firmwares. But it appears that there is an awful lot of unifying hardware in the world because all those 12 firmwares have been downloaded millions of times, and it's brilliant for end users who don't have to worry about their machines being taken over at coffee shops and things with unifying Mousejack. Now I put down 2019 for Logitech, but it's not kind of tells the whole story because Logitech relies quite a lot on their ODMs, actual people that make the machines. And so Lenovo's way of doing it was to get their ODMs and their IHVs, their independent hardware vendors, people like, I don't know, Wacom, Realtek, VIA, that kind of thing. People actually make the silicon that gets sold to the people like Foxconn, Wistron, the ODMs, and then kind of sell it on to under contract to the OEM. And so we kind of integrated the entire supply chain. So there were VIA engineers writing plugins for VIA USB hubs and Realtek engineers writing plugins for Realtek USB to Ethernet drivers and stuff. So that was great. And Lenovo obviously reused the code that was written for Thunderbolt and reused the Synaptics MST and the UFI Capsule, but still had to write quite a lot of code themselves. And so they were probably working on this before the Logitech announcement. But in our means, we have ThinkPad, ThinkCenter, ThinkStation hardware supported, which is great. HP last year literally found out they were losing contracts because they couldn't supply firmware updates in the LVFS and were kind of forced to add support for some models that they wanted to sell for various government contracts and things, and then found out actually there was a huge PR win for joining the LVFS and that sales of those models went up spectacularly. So they've added a support this year for an awful lot more hardware, and I've been told an awful lot more is planned. And HP, all they had to do was write the HP specific plugins for things like the HP CMX hubs and things. But they could reuse the VIA plugin written by Lenovo and the unifying hardware written by Logitech and Synaptics MST by Dell. You can sort of see how this is going. Like, I've only listed a few OEMs here, but the most common thing, OEMs join the LVFS now, and they just can't believe that it's free. So someone will join and they'll say, look, I've got this hub, it's got a VIA USB hub and this Realtek chip, and it's got this ANX chip. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's supported. You just have to add these 6 lines to this file with your vendor ID and your product ID, and it just magically works. And they're like, how does this work? It's incomprehensible. They don't have to pay any money. They don't have to do any work. It's the fact that open source means you can all reuse the same code, and we can all support this, all of these different products with this one code base. And they're coming from this world where they always have to pay, they always have to get paid to do this work over and over again for all these different OEMs. And it's just a complete kind of, brain just explodes. The other question I get asked is, how is this free? And I'll sort of come to that in a minute. So one of the things that surprised me is people started using updates on the LVFS as a way of choosing which hardware to buy. This maybe isn't such a surprise for people like kind of Linux users and sort of people using this stuff in the community, but actually the graphs like you can see now were a direct direct kind of ask from the UK government, because they said, look, we want to choose laptops which are supported on the LVFS, and we don't want to choose laptops that only have, say, one update, just so they get the little green checkbox. But we actually want to see that they're actually supporting these laptops over the last few years. And so there's now public graphs on the LVFS, which means you can just look at every single model and see how long has this model been supported for. And here you can see there's a XPS 15, which I guess on average probably has about one update per quarter, which is fairly typical. And some vendors are very good at this. Other vendors might only release one or two updates the first year, and then they become kind of like just critical security issues only. This is quite a surprise. This is something that I didn't expect. But it also means it's been, so like, is on the LVFS, is now been baked into various US and UK purchasing policy, which is kind of for an ecosystem that's brilliant. Now, like I said, a lot of people are very surprised this is free. They don't understand that the question I get asked all the time is, how long is it free for? Like, at what point do the fees kick in? And the way it works is, like my job is being paid for by Red Hat, and Red Hat are paying me to kind of build this ecosystem and build all these different companies and this shared code. And I think what happened, I guess a couple of years ago, is the likes of Dell, Lenovo, HP, etc., went to the Linux Foundation and said, "Look, we're building this multi-million-dollar business on this Linux kind of pipeline, and we're relying on this random bloke in England with this server that's running under the stairs. Can you kind of sort of professionalize that a bit?" So Linux Foundation now, they supplied a couple of sysadmins, which basically took my web service, made it Amazoned, made it into microservice. It's all running completely scalably now. It's all backed up minute by minute and stuff. And it's great that it's also not my problem. So if it goes down in the middle of the night, someone else gets paged and they fix it. And that's great. Also, the key thing here is that Red Hat is this neutral party. It's like the UN. So it's like when if Dell had gone to Lenovo and said, "Hey, do you want to join this Dell.lvfs.com thing?" Probably Lenovo probably would have said no. But seeing as Red Hat is this neutral third party that doesn't really have any skin in the game either way, it's sort of really useful like that. Of course, I don't scale. I'm just one person, and I can't deal with 30 different OEMs. And so there's I think it's about a dozen different consulting companies now, which provide like people provide the ability to write plugins or converting old legacy code to the new kind of G-Objecty code, or just train people on how licensing works and how the LVFS actual like UX works as well. So let's get into the more interesting part to the presentation. Oh, there's one more. So there's one of the things we trialed is any engineer can have an LVFS account. They don't have to go through the whole legal thing if they just want to test things out privately, which meant that we could sort of build the ecosystem using the engineers. So a Realtek engineer could go create an account on the LVFS, upload Realtek firmware, find out how easy it is, and say to his boss and say, "Look, well, this is something that's going to cost us no money and get us a huge amount of PR and means we can bid on these contracts." And then it's not me talking to sort of like the Realtek CTO, it's some manager talking to the Realtek CTO, which is a good way of sort of onboarding random companies to try and do your thing. But really, at the end of the day, the OEMs just want an easy life. Like Lenovo told all their ODMs, their suppliers, that LVFS and FWD is required. Dell, similar. Google have basically said that if you don't do the FWD thing, you lose the Design for Chromebook. Also, it works with Chromebook sticker, which is a big deal apparently. But they don't require use of the LVFS, which is fine. And the idea is here that you basically the OEM can choose any rules it likes, so you can make it someone else's problem rather than having to worry about all the different relationships. So I guess this is the slide that's more important from an LAS kind of building an ecosystem point of view. So I guess the main things here is that we want to be installed by default. If someone like Lenovo went to Red Hat and said, "Hey, we've got this new architecture, this new script, or this new binary we use to install firmware on these servers," rather than saying, "Well, you could install this other thing, which also does the same thing. If you're installed by default, it means we already have something installed. You probably should use the thing that's already installed rather than having to install this extra thing. Also, because it's being like it's already part of RHEL, it's not a case of it's adding one extra file to a package rather than adding a whole new package and sort of defining an SLA and maintainer and all that kind of stuff. So actually, the benefit of it being there is amazingly important. The other thing is being enabled by default. So, like for instance, Ubuntu, I guess it must be great having the Snap Store enabled by default, and it's not a luxury we have in Fedora with Flatpak. Maybe in the future, but not now. So having the LVFS enabled by default means that rather than someone like HPE saying, "Could you add this extra remote so that all your servers contact this web server so that we can get firmware updates?" Because there's something else already installed by default, you can say to them, just use the thing that we already have, which is quite a compelling reason rather than just saying you can do one or the other. Also, the idea of the plugins were that you could have the IHV for VIA, who make like USB hubs and lots of other stuff, can own that bit of the code base. They don't feel like they're completely out of control, that they have no control over this open source project. They are kind of integral part of it. And it kind of means they have their own little like fiefdom, which they can sort of control. The second point, I guess, is kind of against the idea of trying to avoid architecture astronauting, but sooner or later you do have to just build functionality and kind of hope someone's going to use it. And so I'll be developing features, like especially with the plugin library, where I wasn't quite sure which vendors were going to be joining, but I kind of knew that we'd probably need some, I don't know, USB control transfer abstraction, or we might need some, I don't know, Endian safe byte read functions. And so sooner or later it does come down to actually writing some code so that the first person who says, "Hey, I want to be part of your club," doesn't have to write half the ecosystem before they can actually do something worthwhile. This means that for the first year or two, it was me writing an awful lot of code late at night, kind of praying that someone would use the code that I'd spent all this time writing. The other, I guess the last point with that is, right from the start, it was made very obvious by every single OEM and ODM I talked to that forward and backwards compatibility were a must. You can't just convince millions of people running Linux, all sorts of old Debians, and the people running with some Arch Linux system. You can't convince everyone to update to something at the same time. And in the same way, you can't ask OEMs who have literally put things into contracts with their suppliers to do something a different way now. And so all the file formats and all the metadata are all forwards and backwards compatible. So you can take a package that's been uploaded today and install it on the oldest Debian stable. And similarly, any package that was uploaded at Debian stable, you can deploy it with the latest FWD. And that compatibility forwards and backwards is really hard. But if you design right from the start, it's the difference between another kind of ecosystem where you don't have that compatibility. Last point on this slide is we designed the system to not be cloned, in that we didn't want there to be an Intel LVFS. Now, you probably trust Intel because you're running an Intel processor, you have an Intel microcode running right now. Because we didn't want things like an HPE LVFS. It'd be weird if you're on a Dell laptop for it to be pinging support.hpe.com every day. If nothing else, from a privacy point of view and a bandwidth and a power usage point of view as well. But also some vendors that you're using stuff like, if you're using a Bluetooth mouse, you're probably using Pixart, which is probably a company you've never even heard of, and you'd get kind of freaked out if your PC was contacting them every day with your IP address and user agent. So the idea is, although it's all open source code, and even the website is all completely GPL code, you actually to spin up an instance is actually quite hard. And because the signing key is part of the FWD package rather than downloaded from the LVFS, there's deliberately no way of adding extra signing keys or updating existing signing keys or adding remotes for other vendors. And so it's a case of you either play by the rules that we've got or you can't deploy your firmware, which is kind of an aggressive but kind of essential part of not being fragmented. Like this is like, it's like a hugely monolithic kind of design, but it wouldn't have had the success that it had without these kind of sort of strict rules that stopped this fragmentation. for, I guess, a few different reasons. The other thing that's important is the OEM already does things a certain way. Like Dell already calls their firmware package tag, and Lenovo calls it a build package name. And so by providing it a way of, basically, this is like an hour's work, but it meant that the Lenovo engineers that were uploading firmware could see the terms and the URLs they were familiar with, rather than forcing them to learn about things like build package names or something. In the same way that with Flatpak, you wouldn't maybe expect the Microsoft engineers to learn about the Flatpak manifest, because it's a technology they're not using already. So maybe there's some sort of like work that can be done there, making it kind of more similar to the system that they're using already. And also existing contracts exist between companies. This is maybe less relevant from an app ecosystem point of view, maybe more relevant from a firmware ecosystem point of view, but you can't assume that your new fancy distribution method is going to be the one that's going to be the only one that people are using. So you kind of have to assume that, for instance, here that Wistron or Foxconn or whoever the ODM is supplying hardware for an OEM, whom that firmware might have come originally from the IBV, like Phoenix or AMI or something. And so the LVFS has this idea that all the different companies would log in, and then the firmware can be shared between companies. So we kind of we did all that work to integrate all these different suppliers, which when the easier thing to do would be just let Lenovo upload the firmware. But it means that you're not then embedded into their supply chain. You're just sort of just like a FTP site. Now, this meant that now when the contracts are negotiated between the ODMs and the IBVs, that the LVFS and having an engineer that is familiar with uploading to the LVFS is part of the contract, which is awesome, because this means that the ecosystem gets kind of cemented into this kind of this firmware thing, and it's working really well. But of course, you're not the only ecosystem. So in the same way that Flatpak has Snap and Snap has Flatpak, there are two worlds, or there are multiple worlds. And so our worlds at the moment are Windows Update and the LVFS. And here a company called Eclipsium have access to some of the Microsoft data and also from the vendors themselves. And we've actually provided tools for the vendors to kind of remind them when maybe Linux users might have got left out. And there's, I think in Will's talk yesterday, there was some about some of the work on Flatpak manifests, where it might not be the Flatpak is being uploaded by the original software author, and it might be that the original software author has chosen a different world to upload their software to. It's actually giving the kind of the packager the tools so that they know when things are out of date or when things need updating, or even automating it completely. Like, for instance, Dell. This is very useless for Dell, because Dell has this build pipeline which automatically has a robot user which uploads firmware for various different models, which then get QA'd by real people and then pushed to stable. But for someone like Lenovo, where it's a bit more manual, this is really useful, and they can see at a glance what software is maybe not up to date, both on LVFS and Windows Update. So we've supplied like 27.7, it's like 28.0 now firmware files. It's like a 1.2 million a month or something now. But that might be a massive underestimate, because as I mentioned right at the start, we have the idea of where you can mirror the entire LVFS without us knowing about it for either security, privacy, or any other reason. But we know that 2.1 million people have reported back success, which is not unexpected, because we only ask 1% people using the console. So you can kind of like use some back of the envelope maths and probably say that we've supplied really over 100 million firmware files, which is something I'm really proud of. And when you take those numbers to an OEM and say, look, this is the number we know, and we know that 12 million people every day look for the latest update, that's kind of super numbers that kind of take people's notice. So Dell said that it's now strategically important for them to support the LVFS. They've had a lot of good PR and also good business from this. Lenovo has said that standardizing has been seamless. And I was just talking to Intelligent a few days ago, and they said they use Windows Update and LVFS, and they called the Windows Update system painful. And they said it compared it being night and day compared to using the LVFS. which I took as a really big compliment. And there's various people asking, can we use the LVFS on other platforms? So Google already using it on Chrome OS. But people say, well, can we use it on Windows as well? Which is something that's kind of blurs a line a little bit, and it's not something I'm super comfortable with. But yeah, maybe, I'm not sure. So thank you for listening. I rattled through this really quickly. I have personal email, Red Hat email, and I also have Twitter. You can talk to me, grab me on any, and talk to me about any stuff. Thank you for listening, I guess.
Shared notes on the left side of the screen.
Right, shared notes. Right, so we have some questions.
Yeah,
so, how hard it is to get into the firmware world with that very little experience? When you graduate, how hard it is to find a company that hires you and actually provides lectures to put your knowledge about programming, or the ecosystem of firmware, hardware, etc. So I guess it's a kind of a big question, but I'm an electronic engineer by trade. So I graduated from Surrey Uni, went to work for a defence contractor, doing electronic stuff, and kind of got into software. But really, like, firmware isn't this big scary thing. Like, programming on an Arduino is firmware. Like, when you flash an Arduino, that's what I call firmware. So all you have to do is like play with something like a PIC microcontroller, microbit or something. And we have people distributing firmware on the LVFS for Arduino stuff. So you don't have to be some massive company like Dell. Some people might only have 200 sales of some product from some open hardware product, and they use the LVFS for distributing that. That's sort of super useful for them. Right, I guess that's sort of fudged that first question. Second one, how do you persuade companies to add their hardware firmware to LVFS, and is some company easier to persuade than others as the GNU Linux doesn't work it? So it's really hard. So ask me that question 5 years ago, and I would have said you have to ask on Twitter, find their social media account, try and get a contact in a company, file bugs, call the support line, etc. Nowadays, that's less true. Nowadays, it's vendors who are bidding for government contracts finding they can't bid unless they have support on the LVFS for their firmware, because the government contract wants to use the LVFS service to avoid obsolescence or security issues, or for some sort of certification. So it's kind of changed in the last 5 years from me pleading with vendors to them pleading with me. So I've had vendors come to me in the past and said, look, we have this multi-million-dollar sale, and we can't complete this sale with this customer until the LVFS stuff has happened. Can you just say that the LVFS stuff has happened, and then we'll do it in the next few months? And I'm like, so that's fraud. And anyway, so heaven and earth gets moved, and they actually do the work that they need to do, and the contract gets signed. So I can kind of switch from being kind of asking like nicely to kind of being blunt, being an asshole, because I can say, I need you to use this metadata format, I need you to supply this data, I need you to do these steps, I need you to do this legal release, I need you not to have a EULA, I need you to not have a warranty statement, all this kind of stuff where I can be quite blunt now. And actually, although the Linux market is 2 or 3%, that's kind of the consumer kind of side of the Linux market. If you're someone like the US government, UK government or something, you're not the sort of person that's going to be filling in a survey that says, oh, I use Linux, I use this distro, I use this hardware. So my gut instinct says that like in enterprise, it's just hugely bigger than that number. Just looking at the amount of effort companies put in on this kind of stuff. The other thing, of course, is Chrome OS. When Google turned around and said, we want to use FWD on Chrome OS, which was, I guess, for three reasons. One was they had a huge number of updaters on their in their MMC storage that is really expensive, and each updater was like a 60 megabyte statically linked blob, and with FWD, each one of those updaters is a 15 kilobyte blob, because it's all using this shared functionality. The other thing is security. So the security team at Google could actually review the code and say, look, this has passed our internal security review, and we're going to build it and then distribute it to thousands of computers. And it also meant that they could distribute firmware updates, all the stuff that we developed on Linux, and use it on Chrome OS with almost no work. They could just integrate it into their own boot process. which meant that the whole kind of works with Chromebook certification, which to me is just a sticker, is a huge deal for all these companies. So Christmas last year, I had about maybe 30 or 40 different companies sort of contact me and say, look, we need this, otherwise we lose the sticker. And so it was a very busy couple of months telling people about licensing and how we collaborate and how pull requests work and that kind of thing. And that's where the need for the consulting companies came. So like the 3M Debs, the Collabras, all the other kind of the companies that we're familiar with from like for developing Linux apps are now the ones that are helping helping the vendors get their firmware on the LVFS and also get their flashing protocols into FWD where we can all share them. So last question, would you envision LVFS being used on more bespoke systems like cars and other IoT devices? Really good question, and I know people are using FWD on, there's a, I guess, big oil company which is using like a bazillion IoT nodes for measuring ground movement, and they're using FWD to deploy the firmware. Now, they're not using the LVFS because what they want to do is they want to do like a staged deployment. You don't want one update which bricks 10,000 nodes. So they're doing test deployments on like lab versions of each different type of hardware, and then before it goes out onto these sort of thousands of nodes, they're actually, I think they're using like something like Ansible or something like a Puppety type thing to deploy the firmware using FWD. So the fact that the firmware has been obtained from the LVFS is really useful for them because it's signed and they know where it's come from and they can rely on the vendor to supply updates for this hardware. It's probably more useful for them to control distribution themselves, which is something we kind of I don't get into the whole kind of like fleet management stuff. That's not something that I think FWD or the LVFS wants to deal with. Basically, here's the metadata, here's the mechanism, and you can connect them however you like, which is kind of also how people like Google do it as well. So I think that's all the questions, and I think I've got no time. So thank you all for listening. If anyone wants to contact me, use Twitter, use my work email, use my personal email. I'll be happy to answer questions there as well.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We are going to move to the next talk, and we are going to listen. Rhys Davis, I think I spelled it correctly. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. And let's see if Rhys is already ready. Rhys, are you ready? I can't unlock you. Hope someone can do it so that you can rejoin with Mike. Yes, I can't unlock you. Christy, you around? Can you unlock Rhys? Give me a second, please. Christ is not around, I guess. You are unlocked now. Try to rejoin with your mic. Okay, I think you're... Yes, just add to unmute now. I think you're ready to go.
I think
You can start.
so.
Hello. Welcome.
Okay.
Maybe you can turn your volume a little bit up.
My volume up a little bit?
Yeah. Okay.
Is that a bit, is
Seems
that
good
better?
now. Seems good. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. We're working. Good. Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Reese. You pronounced it wonderfully. Thank you. I'm not sure who put the scheduling together, but next time I think I'll ask to go before Richard, because that was very good. So from one random English bloke to another. First, I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for staying so long. I know if this was an in-person conference, everyone would have gotten a drink at the break before last. So while I introduce myself, please feel free to get yourself a beer or some non-alcoholic beverage before I start chatting away. This is the last talk, so I'm thinking of it for myself as a sort of closing keynote for my own ego, but really it's just the last talk. So I'll just get started. The title of this talk, as you can see, is Arm Yourself with an Ecosystem of Linux Apps. Soon, the abstract for this talk was soon the likes of Apple's M1 chip won't cost an arm and a leg. In the not too distant future, adding ARM support to your applications is going to be crucial for reaching users both old and new. And with everything happening with Apple and with the acquisition of ARM by NVIDIA potentially coming soon, I wanted to talk a little bit about Ubuntu's plan for support and how you can start testing and developing for ARM using software and workflows that you're using today already. So let me just close the chat here so I don't get too distracted. And we can dive in. Next slide. Okay, cool. So first I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Rhys Davis. I'm a developer advocate for Ubuntu, for Canonical. I've been in this role for a few months now, where I've joined the community team, the rebooted community team, I should say, at Canonical, focusing specifically on supporting and helping the Ubuntu community grow and enable them to do things. Before that, I was a product manager for Canonical for about a year and a half, where I looked after numerous different products over there, from robotics and IoT type things and snaps to a little bit of desktop, a little bit of multipass, some virtualization stacks, that kind of thing. So I covered a lot of the landscape, and along the way, I very much drank the open source Kool-Aid. And it was part of the reason I joined the company and joined Canonical in the first place. But then the more I got into it, the more I enjoyed, the more I saw the value in what folks like you do and what open source is about and open source principles. And I really sort of got inspired. And then a couple of other things about me. I like books. I like reading. I'm a big old book nerd when it comes to reading and writing. I joined the circus for a few months, not terribly long ago. I ran away with the circus, and the little groovy gorilla down there was the Ubuntu release that I last sort of led, and I've got a little Ubuntu t-shirt here. I just want to say as well, before I get into the rest, the meat of the presentation, while Richard's story before me was very good and very interesting and very real, mine's a bit more of a thought experiment, a bit more of a fiction. So yeah, let's go. All right. The animations didn't work terribly well. Okay. Once upon a time. So yeah, so I'm going to be telling you a little bit of a story. So bear with me if it starts to get a bit weird. Once upon a time, in a hole in the ground, in a cupboard under the stairs, in a galaxy far, far away, or on GitHub, I want everybody to imagine a developer. She is like many of us. Maybe she has a job. Maybe she works for a tech company. Maybe she works in a corner shop. It doesn't really matter. But she's just getting started in app development. Let's say she spends her time surfing the web, scrolling through projects, looking at open source repos, looking for something to contribute to. And she has an idea. She wants to build an app. Whatever that app is, it doesn't matter. Let's just say it's any app. For now, let's say it's a command line tool that, I don't know, tracks the stocks that she's invested in. We'll call it Stonker. Just for the sake of this presentation, since it's the last one and we can have a little bit of fun. That was supposed to be an animation on the screen, so it's a bit of a surprise, but there we are. She does this in her free time, after work, on the weekends. She really wants to build something of it, help people track their stonks. Maybe she wants to roadmap some work to add a feature to crawl Reddit for the next opportunity to stick it to the man in the future. Maybe even build a community around her app. But that's all down the road. The first problem is just where to start. For the sake of this story, for the sake of this presentation, let's say this is her first time developing an app, an open source app. That way we can look at what's out there a little bit more and really dig into a first timer's experience and really examine the whole process a little bit. I'm sure we've all been there. I know I have, where we have this idea, maybe a project idea, maybe something we want to contribute to, and we go hunting for where to start, where to begin, how to begin, quite importantly. And well, so let's have a look at what she might find. Here we see our first sort of plot twist. How do you get started? Well, where would you begin? I think we need more articles about this kind of thing, about where to begin with Linux apps. If you just search how to develop an app, if you don't know anything about Linux, and for this case, obviously, we're assuming that we don't know anything about Linux, you would find yourself in a rabbit hole of mobile apps. I didn't take any screenshots, only because it looked a bit weird on the slide, so I did what we did here. Apologies for the funky colors. I'm not a designer. This is no other filters. Of course, if she knew she was interested in Linux, maybe she would have added Linux, but maybe she wouldn't as well. If she went off on her first search, here she'd end up down the mobile app rabbit hole and would have found her way to iOS or Android long before she would have thought about Linux. It seems like any bloggers out there have a nice SEO target with this. Even when I searched desktop, as you can see here specifically, it was all Windows documentation, and that's Windows documentation. And in my personal opinion, those docs aren't particularly good, very attractive looking. So this is sort of my first call to action. I'll get into the point of this talk in a second, I promise. We need more visibility on developing Linux apps in terms of documentation and writing and blog posts and people talking about it. If we want first timers to go down the good, happy Linux rabbit hole, and I think we do, let's start targeting getting started blogs at specific keywords or building up the Google Juice weightings of sites that are doing this already. I'm not sure if you'll get these slides after the event or not, but there's a nice URL at the bottom of it. You can see there of the search results that only came up when I looked for, which was the only Linux related thing that I came up when I searched this, actually, which was makealinux.app. I'm sure some of you would have seen it before, or even maybe even had a hand in building it, but it's a place to go, a place to start. It's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for in terms of distribution of people, but we also need people talking about the apps that they're making. And conferences like this are an awesome thing for doing that. It just needs to translate into Google Juice, right? My contact details are at the end of this presentation. If you're writing a Linux app blog or creating Linux app content and would like a hand optimizing for this kind of thing, you can just let me know. Anyway, this is the Linux App Summit. So let's move past this. Let's say she finds her way to open source, maybe to Linux, but more importantly, she finds her way to open source communities, somewhere she can do her work in the open. And if she runs into issues, there are active forums for questions and users for contributions. She hasn't got time for courses, let's say. She just wants to get stuck in. So she looks for tutorials, right? Documentation, maybe YouTube videos, surely. I know I would. Now, this is where we need a little bit of suspension of disbelief. She's reading through the documentation. She's watching the YouTube videos, getting inspired. There's a lot of interesting things going on, but in her search, she's looking for something new, something exciting, something that she can get ahead of and really try something. Now, this is a bit of a jump, but maybe she sees certain developers she follows on Twitter, say, raving about the M1 chip. More specifically, she finds maybe the Apple MacBook Air with an M1 chip. People talking about that for better or for worse. Ooh, she thinks, right? It's the new shiny. It's interesting. It's performant. Okay. It's Apple. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. It's expensive, which is a pain. But it's got an ARM processor. Hello. That's interesting. She realizes, wait a minute, what would have to be, that would have to be a whole new class of application, right? It would have to be built for this hardware, built for ARM hardware. So she searches around, what's up with ARM, right? And no, we don't. Let's try ARM Silicon, because this isn't what we're here for. It was all Apple. apps on ARM Silicon just gives you everything Apple, or at least it did for me in my location. Now that's doing a good job of articles. Apple have really sort of cornered this one. Maybe if there are any people out there amongst you who want to start writing documentation or tutorials for Linux app development on ARM, this is another sort of SEO sort of Google target for you. And again, I'd be happy to help juicing those articles for Google, because it looks like we need a lot more visibility for the apps keyword in general. But let's say, for the sake of brevity, she finds herself on the NVIDIA news, right? She goes looking for an ARM-specific content, and perhaps the Fable algorithm throws up a news article. Now, of course, she's heard of NVIDIA, right? Who hasn't? She knows they do crazy GPU stuff, right? Cool. NVIDIA is acquiring ARM. Oh, now that is something she picks up on. That's something that's quite interesting. Blink, next slide. Okay, so this could be serious, right? Not just sort of fruit associated with Apple. Wait. Okay, so she realizes the implications of this. Even if we just zoom in on Linux and desktop applications, if folks like Apple are already moving towards desktop class ARM hardware, you can bet your bottom dollar other hardware vendors are working on it too. Equally, you can bet NVIDIA have noticed. I've seen a lot of good things about it, but that really doesn't matter. The point is, with ARM, a company partners with just about everybody: Microsoft, Intel, Qualcomm, Apple, Amazon, IBM, Nintendo, and so on. On embedded devices, getting leveled up by sort of NVIDIA's GPUs and servers and supercomputer stacks, you can be sure that embedded devices will get smarter. And workstation vendors will be able to leverage that technology. And it means that Linux will be coming to embedded devices and ARM desktops, certainly, which is all on its way, right? So what's missing over there? As ever, it's apps, right? Building new or adapting old Linux apps for ARM is going to become crucial. And she recognizes this. Let's say she recognizes this in our presentation. So she thinks, okay, what else is ARM? How can we learn more? So she discovers ARM is typically for the embedded space, right? Okay, phones, nice. Fridges, that's cool. Tablets, that's interesting. IoT devices, that's buzzwordy. But where's the innovation right now? She looks around and it's cloud, right? It's Amazon Graviton 2. There's a 2. Edge compute, clustering, blah, blah, blah. Okay, she's convinced there's definitely a future in this. So she decides to dig in. Now, I'm aware this isn't normally how application development goes. People don't usually decide on the architecture first, I'd presume. I'm not a developer, so I wouldn't know specifically, but just bear with me. We'll get to that. So she wants to start developing for this, shall we say, non-standard architecture for desktop apps. So she definitely wants to do that, but she wants to get ahead of the curve, break new ground. Maybe she could turn it into a mobile or embedded app later. On the face of it, it looks hard, especially to a beginner. There's not a lot of tutorials or examples out there at the moment. And as we've seen, what does exist is Apple. Maybe there are paid for courses, but that's no good to her. Maybe it becomes expensive. You very quickly find articles telling you that you need an ARM device to build ARM on. Does that mean she has to buy the M1 to develop desktop apps? Does that mean you have to build in the cloud? Is there no way around that, or is there no way to build for ARM on another architecture? Okay, she thinks, okay. This is a lot. So she thinks, let's try and start at the bottom, right? ARM is a company. Maybe they have a place to start. Okay, good. They do. There's forums, there's docs, perfect. So you have to scroll through, but it's a lot about embedded stuff, not necessarily applications, but there's no need to panic. There's a Linux section. Okay, it's not super helpful, but right, Linux. ARM is still very embedded. Apps are a couple of layers up. Linux. This is a good sign. ARM have their docs ready. There's a lot of debugging and Docker, but not so much for what she's looking for just yet. So she goes looking for Linux apps. And I'm pleased to say she found this conference when she was looking for Linux apps. But since this talk is about Linux apps for ARM, let's focus over there. And what I mean by that is when I've searched for Linux apps, I found references to this conference. So that's very, very good. So the first thing she finds is a Reddit thread talking about Ubuntu, and I thank goodness for that, since that's what I'm advocating for. And then later on, there is a thread on this website, raspberrypi.org, which is interesting. She thinks maybe there's like a super active niche community for making baking apps. Yeah, I know she would know about the Raspberry Pi unless she was living under a bridge, but jokes about baked goods are fun, and I'm pretty sure those guys like it. So she thinks to herself, can I do this? Can she do it? Can you get ahead of this kind of curve and write applications for ARM that will run on Graviton and that will run on the M1 chip? Apps that cater for the incoming ARM-based future, if that happens. Maybe she can get ahead of the ARM apps ecosystem. Maybe she can make ARM the first-class citizen of her app, but of course build up and around on other architectures as well. Maybe she can even write tutorials and documentation and become something of an influencer in this space before it really even takes off. It's safe to say, I think, that pretty soon ARM-based hardware won't cost an arm and a leg. And it doesn't even at the moment, right? And NVIDIA may well bring it to every developer on the planet in a not terribly distant future. So can she do this? Spoiler alert for this fictitious talk, she can, but she needs to start making some decisions. Let's open some ARM docs in tabs that will likely never close until our computer crashes, and every other thing we find linked to all over the shop. ARM, Ubuntu, there are links to Snapcraft and Launchpad on the screen here, but we'll get to that stuff later, don't worry. GitHub, Raspberry Pi. Okay, so she thinks next, let's get ourselves into the forums and over onto the YouTubes. Maybe she spots this new ARM software developers channel, which you can see on screen here. This is a neat little software developers YouTube channel from the advocacy or the developer relations teams over there at ARM, and it talks about what's going on with ARM, what partners and community people are doing, what they're working on, and most importantly, it talks about developing software for ARM. They have a series on game development at the moment. They do live streams. It's pretty cool. Okay, it doesn't matter. I'm not. Okay, anyway. So she finds that that's a good thing. That's good. That's good, interesting stuff. That's ARM support. That's the ARM knowledge taken into account. And then she looks to learn more about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is nice and it's free and it's good. And there are Ubuntu images for ARM. That's good for if she wants to start developing natively. She pops into the Ubuntu discourse to see what's going on. It's a very active discourse, lots of people talking about lots of different things. Well, there's not an ARM-specific section. There is a desktop category where people talk every day, and a community category, which is where I live, where she can raise her ideas and talk about what she wants to do and how she wants to contribute. Great. Okay, that's the architecture and Linux taken care of. But I think there's something in between, right? Okay, good. There is support for the baked goods in Ubuntu. That's good. There is a Raspberry Pi support when she wants testing. And there's a community here of developers to help with issues. Okay, stepping back, she's got Ubuntu, Raspberry Pi. Yes, and both of those things are as expensive as it's going to get anyway, so that's something. And it's perfect for testing ARM applications. And there's Ubuntu support. Great. We're ready to go. Reading around on Ubuntu and getting Ubuntu on a Raspberry Pi, she runs into the snap things. She reads packaging. Write an app, package it, and build it to run on a heap of architectures, including ARM. Huh, okay. She can do this. She can see the path, so she writes her Stonker app. Yeah, I remember. It's called Stonker. Okay. Like I said, I'm not a I get the idea here and with developers on their apps, etc. But I'm not an app myself, and everyone listening likely knows more than me. I'm not going to talk through the creation process, but I'll talk a little bit how to get for ARM and for source. So let's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and it's about done. She's written her Stonker app. Okay, so for the sake of this talk, we'll say she used Flutter. Just quickly, for those who don't know, Flutter is a Google a Google's UI toolkit for building natively compiled applications for mobile, web, and desktop. She's focused on ARM, but cross-platform and multi-platform support is always a win. Of course, it could be some other nice cross-platform. Maybe it's Electron. If you're interested in Electron instead, I hope I'm saying your name right. Pradeep gave a very interesting talk on building apps with Electron earlier today. I think that was today. So maybe she would find that documentation instead. It really doesn't matter. Let's say she wrote it on her Ubuntu workstation, because come on, I work for Canonical, and she used VS Codium. Note that's Codium, not VS Code. Codium is not a fork; it's a repository of scripts to automatically build Microsoft's VS Code into freely licensed binaries with a community-driven configuration. You should absolutely check it out, and just like that, she's ready to go. She can build her application and get things going. Now, I know I skipped over those two things quite quickly, Flutter and VS Codium, but like I said, I'm not a developer, and we're focused on the higher level sort of story journey here. There's more information about Flutter on the Ubuntu blog. VS Codium is a snap that you can find in the Snap Store, and there's lots of talks at this conference alone that you could watch. For example, Pradeep, like I already mentioned, or maybe Tobias's talk at the very, very beginning on adaptive apps with GTK. So lots of options. I'm not recommending necessarily these things. It's just these are the options that I would have gone for, let's say. So we have Stonka on GitHub. Maybe I shouldn't have called it Stonka. It's an open source project, because of course it is. And maybe it has one or two other contributors who helped her out in the forums. Okay, great. But really, that's the fun part done, right? The bulk of the work is done. Oh dear, she thinks. Deploying Linux apps. Is she going to start thinking about packaging now? Okay. She holds her breath and she dives in. But of course not. Helpful commentary starts to get a little bit less responsive. Linux apps are great. That's why we're all here, right? That's why this conference is named after them. Linux packaging is typically less great. She finds a lot about how to package your software, a lot of toxicity, a lot of options, of course. Why can't you just compile a Linux binary? Yeah, no, okay. Maybe she can get it into the kernel. No, that's silly as well. We've all heard Linus talk about that by now. So we run into a hurdle, right? We want to build this thing for Linux, because obviously, and we want to build it for ARM for the reasons we've discussed. But of course, there's more than ARM is a bonus, but ARM is what we want. So she starts to flounder. Handcuffed or restrained by choice, what does she choose? RPM, Flatpak, App Image, Snap, Deb, blah, 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 blah. She reads up, she finds some pretty good documentation for each format, communities who are definitely passionate about what they're doing, but the days start ticking by. She doesn't want to pick one and then regret it. She's an app developer, right? Not a software packager. It looks like this is another call to action from me to everyone listening in the future or live, because I want to be right on the nose with this one. I'll just sort of say it. We have a lot of baggage in the Linux app ecosystem. Everyone's talks over the past few days that I've seen, at least, have been really interesting in improving the experience of learning how to do things better or more efficiently, but not a lot to address that I've seen, a lot to address the baggage when it comes to packaging. Now, of course, this presentation is going to go in a sort of packaging direction, and I'm not here to start fights. What we need is a sort of an objective measurement of what packaging is best for what use cases, and then work on that sort of wider support. Okay. I touch on this again later, but if representatives of packaging formats want to talk, the Ubuntu community team that I am a part of would love to sort of join the discussion. Anyway, right, she's in this hole, this packaging hole, right? Enter plot twist number 2. Hopefully, enter one of you folks. She drops her concern in a forum. It doesn't matter where. She just drops it in a forum. And lo and behold, a trusted advisor, a community leader, maybe one of you good folks, responds with something like this. Packaging and distribution of a mess. The options can be good, and they're all good for different reasons. Just remember It's the app that matters. And thanks for writing it for Linux. So what are your goals? What's your use case? And we'll see what packaging is right for you. Blink, blink. Thank you, anonymous community leader. So she wants this to work on Linux, but most importantly, she wants it to work on ARM. So the packaging has to have ARM support. She wants it to become a thing and keep developing. So she wants to have an easy way to update it. And of course, security is important too. It is. So this community leader is going to recommend to her snaps, because again, of course they are. But let me reiterate, the packaging is less important than the app here. Plus, my friend and colleague Igor gave a nice talk about snaps earlier in the event, yesterday afternoon for me. So you'll all know all about them by now, and they're pretty cool, and they're a nice fit for this use case. So she gets into the docs. Here we go. There's a lot of documentation around snapping an app, snapping a Flutter app specifically, and some nice articles written by some first-timers. That one's by me. She learns that snapping an app for ARM is not only possible, but is already being done all over the Snap ecosystem. Quick digression again here, just in case you don't know, snaps are application containers that bundle libraries and dependencies inside themselves. You can integrate packaging snaps with your CI/CD pipelines. You can take advantage of the Snapcraft extension for specific kinds of middleware. I actually know a couple of folks who build ROS, robotic operating system snaps for their robots. And once the application is snapped, it can be available on the Snap Store to run on any Linux distribution that runs Snap systemd, and so that it can be kept up to date and maintained and promoted and so on. Okay. Next, she would have to write her YAML. This is effectively the snap itself. It's where all the plugs and interfaces get added and where you can make the app strictly confined. This comes from the early days when snaps were built and designed for IoT devices and to run on embedded architectures like a phone. This strict confinement is what gives snaps their sort of container nature. So where LXC or something of that ilk could be seen as a sort of machine container, a Docker container could be seen as a sort of process container. A snap can be seen as sort of an application container, right? They package code and dependencies, like I mentioned before, into an sort of isolated and immutable. So they're isolated and immutable with a writable area separated from the rest of the system, but visible to the host. And now I'm not going to go and keep giving the spiel and selling snaps, but you can be sure they're a good choice for ARM applications, especially one like Stonka. So she makes Stonka strictly confined because why not? She guesses security is important. I know I've heard it from lots of folks, and yes, security is important. She guessed right. And we move on to the next slide. And then she builds it remotely. So this is a Snapcraft feature that lets you build on someone else's computer. It's a super nifty and easy way if you want to actually do things with your computer while things build and it doesn't take up all your resources. Everything's built on Launchpad, so you can drain that canonical infrastructure instead of your own. There is sometimes a queue, but rarely does it take that long. Anyway. Okay, so let's say her build works. That's good. It spits out numerous images, including an AMD 64 image and an ARM image. She tries it on her laptop. She tries the AMD 64 image on her laptop. Okay, that one works. But that's not what she cares about, right? What she cares about is the ARM architecture, as we have discussed. So she fires up Ubuntu on her Raspberry Pi 400, as you can see on the slide here. Okay, it works there too. She installs it, it runs, she tests it, it's good. Not just the 400, of course. Ubuntu server is certified to work on all the Raspberry Pis with a higher version number than 2, and Ubuntu desktop works grand on Pi 4s, Pi 400s, and naturally the desktop needs the 4 GB model minimum, but it works. Little sort of side note there because I worked on that stuff. Where was I? Okay, so she can get herself on this accessible ARM hardware, Raspberry Pis, Raspberry Pi 400s, whatever it is, and she's confident because there's 2 communities around it, Ubuntu and Raspberry Pi, that will work, and she'll be able to test these things if they're not developed natively, because she'll be able to do the remote build system, which will build on ARM, or she could test natively. So she kicks the tires. She makes sure that everything she wants the app to do works. Good. Maybe she gets in touch with me or one of my colleagues to talk about testing. We've run testing days in recent history of for the Ubuntu images themselves. There's no reason she couldn't, if she wanted to, start an app testers thread herself or a group and crack on with some sweet application testing. And she goes to the Snap store and she reserves the name Stonker. Starting to regret the name. And she builds for every architecture. She sends them to the global Snap store. Next slide. She hooks it up to her GitHub repo with a few clickety-clacks, such that every time she pushes to her GitHub repo, it triggers a new build that is pushed to the store. That could be straight to her Stonker users or to another channel for personal testing or her community testing that she's now set up and is going with. Good. Sigh. So she sits back, but then she sits back up again, right? Because of what I was talking about before, she makes her Snap landing page look nice. She writes a blog post about her experience. She links to the Snap landing page and the documentation that she found and the sites that she found, and really starts to build this hyperlink trail, not a paper trail, a hyperlink trail. Then, because again, she wants to do this properly, she pops into the Snapcraft forum and she talks about what she's done. I see it, me, Reese. I put it up there on the featured Snap section on the Snap store because it's a pretty damn cool app. And it goes up a few hundred users, maybe a few thousand users. And hold the phone, she thinks to herself. Is that it? Right? Let's check. She has her app. It's open source. It's hosted on GitHub. Nice. There are a couple of contributors because along the way, she found people in the forum, but she can always call for more contributions. She's in the right forums now. It's just a matter of, hopefully, it's just a matter of putting the word out there. Her GitHub repo is hooked up to Snapcraft, so she can keep her app up to date. She can trigger builds for all of the architectures that's relevant to her. And each time we do, we can install the Snap on our Raspberry Pi, kick the tires, test it works, or do the whole process from the beginning on a Raspberry Pi in the first place anyway. Did she just arm herself with a Linux app? Did she just contribute an app to the Linux ecosystem that is going to be able to run on the NVIDIA ARM developer hardware of the future? I think she did. Now, if you go through this whole process of building your app already, and it already exists, you really didn't need to listen to most of my presentation. But if you have similar goals to our protagonist, updatability, cross-distro support, ARM support for the new world on the horizon, you should check out Snaps too. Give yourself a hand and an arm. ARM support for applications, I think, is going to be crucial for reaching out to users, but not just crucial for getting new users, but it could be an opportunity for the Linux ecosystem in general, right? Naturally, there was a lot of snaps in this presentation, and while snaps have a lot of benefits and pros, especially when building for ARM architectures, especially for security and updatability, of course there are other ways. We've heard lots about Flatpak. We've heard lots about a lot these past few days. So again, think back to the trusted advisor, the community leader mentioned, who appeared in this talk. The powerful quote that I just coupled together. It not figuring out with the before packaging. So next slide. In summary, what I want to highlight here were three things. Despite events like this and the work everyone at this conference does, apps on Linux, I'm sure everyone knows, are lacking ability. Next time, you encourage every or a blog, tutorial, or even do a video about app development, a moment to think about developers, how they application. to find your content. And think about what route a new user would have to take. Right? Look at those more accessible. We all can and we all should do this. So trying to beat the algorithm or get the SEO in there, like I mentioned already, but it means signposting where to get started, right? How can we expect people to join our Linux app community highway if they can't find the on-ramp? And next, packages, software packaging brings with it a lot of now I don't need to poo-poo packaging. Like I've said, the technology. I spent all of about a month at Canonical as a Snap advocate before I was moved to the community team. This was not because of Snaps, but an internal thing. In that time, I snapped some things. I wrote about snapping. I learned about Linux applications, and I learned about packaging. Now, as I say, the technology is great, really interesting, and super useful, but the drama is less so. There are some wonderful people in the community who are incredibly constructive and helpful and who get it. And I've virtually messaged numbers of them here at this conference, and it's been great. And there are people who talk about packaging software like it's an extremist branch of a religion. Now, far be it from me to wade into those waters any more than I already have. But for the sake of the Linux app ecosystem, I think we need to find a better way to deal with these issues. If you have ideas, let me know. Maybe we can start a movement. And third and finally, I think we have a unique opportunity with the coming of more Linux-compatible mainstream ARM hardware to solve both of these issues and get ahead of the game. As a Brit, I've been following the acquisition of ARM with a keen eye. The pros and cons are, of course, enormous. And one way or the other, there's going to be a lasting impact on ARM and the general hardware landscape that's out there. If it goes ahead, in theory, possibly, just possibly, there is a huge opportunity to regroup and to kick Linux apps into a new gear. There's a lot of possibility, but if we use this opportunity to get some semblance of coherency, give Linux applications common ground, get them out there ahead of the pack, people, new developers, old developers might take notice. Heck, I know folks at NVIDIA and ARM will see this. They take notice themselves, but it's up to Linux app developers, folks like you guys and girls, apologies, you folks, you people watching, to make it happen. Again, if you have any ideas, I'd like to hear them. We can start a movement. So, hold on, Carlos. Can I just say a few more things? Thank you. So thank you, everyone. As I mentioned a couple of times, if you have questions or would like any more help, I'll get to the questions in the shared notes in a second when I open it. I have some advice to give. So if you'd like help, I don't know, Google juicing your articles, let me know. If you want to talk about the Ubuntu community or have a project idea that I might be able to help you with, or you want to shout at me for being an idiot and you don't like this talk, these are the places on screen you can find me. Come and say hello. And I'll shout out now to keep an eye on that Twitter address on screen and the Ubuntu discourse, because we have some interesting things going in the Ubuntu community. And just before I get to the shared notes as well, I'd like to use this last slot to thank all of the organizers of the Linux App Summit on behalf of myself and also on behalf of Canonical for doing such a tremendous job and keeping on top of everything. I've been lurking in the organizers Telegram channel throughout the whole thing, and everything has been handled quickly and well to keep everything moving. So like Karen Sandler said on the day one, I hope everyone can give a silent applause for such a good event. Cool.
Indeed, great.
To the shared notes.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
No problem. What apps do you think are ideal for new beginning developers to convert or create either existing apps or general classes of apps? So since we're at the Linux App Summit, I'll stick to desktop applications, but the best ones are the simplest ones, I think, for getting started. The first application So I wanted to get into application development a long time ago, and I found sort of no-code tools and things to get things going before I found the Kool-Aid. And the best things I think to start with are the really, really simple things that you can make that would maybe fragmented, that you don't expect to make lots of noise about. Something like Stonker that you would use, even if it's not the best thing ever, because it doesn't really matter. So maybe something like a note-taking app, or a very, very simple note-taking app, or a very, very simple timer. Something that you can do natively, and you can get your wheels turning. Something you could use even if no one else would use it, just because you've made it, and then write about it, and then talk about how you experienced what the experience was like for you, and then tell me about it, and then socialize it and have a great time. 2. So in reality, the new Ubuntu installer that you guys at Canonical are writing in Flutter, and that's going to be released in the future, is going to work on the baked Raspberry Pi. Have you considered that? We have, and we are considering that still. Like you say, in reality, the new Ubuntu installer that those guys are writing in Flutter, that's going to be released in the future, is going to work. We're going to make sure that it works. I hope I haven't dropped the desktop team in it, but that is, I think, fair to say. 3, where can I find other people who are packaging snaps, who could help me debug snaps that I am packaging? Well, let me tell you here. Let me paste this in. This is the Snapcraft. Oh dear, that's not right. .snapcraft.io is the Snapcraft forum where you can sign up and join in and have all the fun. There are people from Canonical who are very, very regularly in there, including myself, but there are also a lot of community contributors and Snap people who are happy to help debug and talk about Snap packaging. And I'm frankly, a lot of folks in there I've seen talk about Snap packaging, and then if you come with your application and they see that maybe Snap isn't the best fit, we can point you in the right direction as well. But to address the first of my sort of calls to action here, I would encourage you to try and do the app, talk about your experience, try and look for packaging, talk about your experience, write about it, blog about it, and let us know, because we'd like to hear. Cool. I think that's all of the questions. Is that the end of my closing keynote?
Thank you.
Closing keynote.
Thank you for replying to the questions.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night or afternoon, wherever you are.
So now we would like to say a few words for the closing of the conference. I hope Adrian is here as well. Adrian, I think that you need to rejoin again with audio. Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, I think that I have unlocked you, but you might still need to relog in. I really hope you all have enjoyed the third day of the conference. And since it's also Thursday, we wanted to do some special thanks Okay, great. We can see you. So thank you all so much for coming and for making our conference great and for being so interactive with the speakers as well. You were a great audience, each of you. We'd like to give some special thanks to our Canonical, Jingling, CodeThink, Collabora, Ambition, OpenSUSE, Fedora, Tuxedo Computers, Pine64, Shells, GitLab, Red Hat, IT Renew, and Linux Magazine. Special thanks to all the sponsors for supporting us again this year. If this conference would have been in person, I would have asked a super big applause for the members of the organizing team. I've been so lucky to be working with an awesome group of people such as Alison Alexandrou, Alesh Paul, Caroline Henriksen, Kenny Coyle, Molly DeBlanc, Leo Koloktronis, and Suram Ramkrishna. You have all been so great. And during all these 3 days, you had the chance to hear our moderators, our volunteers too. They have been great and awesome too. So some special thanks to Giulia Gabrielli, Pagun, Carlos Oliveira, and Abhishek Dutt. Thank you for helping us with this conference. We really appreciate your efforts and spending the time with us and being here for all the times that we needed you. Thank you so much.
But where would we be in a conference without our speakers, our wonderful speakers who've kept everyone entertained for 3 days, and Rice gets the last slide words in there. I'd especially like to thank Karen Sandler and Kathy Giori, our keynote speakers who took us around their houses, both figurative and real. This is just about it for the Linux App Summit this year, but of course there's always new events, upcoming events. So I'd like to mention GUADEC coming up in July. Before you go to GUADEC, you should go to Academy, which, yeah, so let me do this calendar order. Academy, KDE's yearly conference, will be Friday the 18th until Friday the 25th of June. And then the month after, GUADEC, from the 21st to the 25th of July. GNOME Asia is happening sometime. I hope we hear dates for that fairly soon. And then KDE turns 25. Yes, free software has been running for more than a decade. Well, more than 2 decades. More than a generation, in fact, of free software enthusiasts. So mark 14th of October 2021 when we turn 25. Those are our upcoming events. I'd like to remind you to buy the t-shirt. I just have a KDE t-shirt today. I should get the LAS one. And there's a survey link. We'll be sharing that shortly. Please fill it out. We'd like to know what you thought and where you came from. Christy, thank you. Everyone else, thank you. And the attendees, good to have had you here. Ciao.